The swords crossed in the fight with a loud ringing sound. One of the knights holding the position reports that the goblins continue to arrive and demands that the tanks move forward. The leader of the squad urges the knights not to get distracted, warning that it could cost them their lives. At that moment, a guy in a black cape comes up to him from behind. He has light gray hair and gray eyes. An explosion occurs on the battlefield, raising dust that obscures the knight's vision. The leader of the squad turns to the guy and asks if the necromancer can help them, as he promised earlier. The guy takes off the hood of his cape and with a smile on his face agrees to help the squad. The necromancer takes out a staff with a skull on the end, which begins to glow and says that he is here as a mercenary. Placing his hand on the skull on the staff, the necromancer performs a summoning, after which the skull's eye sockets begin to glow with a purple light. When the guy raises the staff up, skeletons armed with different weapons appear on the battlefield. The skeletons rush into battle to help the knights and engage in a fierce battle with the goblins. The knights assume that the guy is the strongest necromancer they know and are surprised at what he forgot in an E-rank dungeon. The necromancer overhears their conversation and hears that he is prophesied to become a ranker. Despite their words, the guy doesn't look happy, because ranker is a status befitting the unique authority of a necromancer. Among 7.9 billion people, only about 1,000 people have this status, as it is a very rare profession. Necromancers of this level are able to summon many dead souls on the battlefield. However, our hero is not like that. He can only summon a few, and one of them is Kostian 1E rank, who is armed with a sword. The second is Kostian 2E rank, who is armed with a spear. And the second type of skeleton, Kostian 3E rank, armed with a bow. The guy pulls his hood back over his head, and we learn that he is a regular necromancer. The squad thinks that the guy is summoning low-level skeletons because he can handle them in an E-rank dungeon. The main character of this story is named Ju Dong-hoon, and his profession is an E-rank cursed necromancer. The necromancer trembles with anger because, despite the fact that he can defeat enemies using terrible spirits and poisons, he is cursed. With tears in his eyes, the necromancer thinks that he envies the knights because he can only summon skeletons. The story began with the fact that about 10 years ago, people began to receive unique abilities from the moment of adulthood at 20 years old. The abilities were completely random. Some received abilities related to blacksmithing or sewing, others healing, reconnaissance, or a buff. Since these abilities were given simply by chance, not everyone liked it. Sometime later, strange monsters began to appear and the abilities acquired by people were able to help cope with this. What was surprising was that despite the curse, Dong-hoon was able to become a necromancer that everyone envied. After a few minutes, the skeletons had already dealt with the crowd of goblins and stood proudly on the mountain of the fallen. The squad of knights was glad that they were able to see the work of the famous necromancer in person. Dong-hoon's growth was slowed down by the fact that he could only summon E-rank skeletons until his death. So he began to wander through dungeons. At this point, the dungeon expedition was completed, and upon arrival at the office, the necromancer reported to the leader that he had finished his work for the day. The man greets him with a friendly smile, and Dong-hoon reports that he completed the group's mercenaries' task in the dungeon and made a report. Having bowed, the necromancer, already dressed in everyday clothes, says that he is going to leave. Without waiting for an answer from the leader, Dong-hoon heads towards the exit and hears a farewell in response only at the door itself. It was already getting dark outside and the air temperature had dropped, causing steam to escape from the mouth when exhaling. Dong-hoon walks alone along the path and sighs, complaining about how strange the world has become. He thinks that his skills are so bad that people don't have any hopes for him. The boy remembers how his skeletons fight using the E-rank skills they have. Dong-hoon thinks that it would be better if he had a production-type ability. The guy looks at his phone and is outraged that despite being a necromancer, his salary after visiting the dungeon is only 40,000 won. He chuckles at the thought that he would earn more with his part-time job. Despite the low salary, this business is the only thing he wants to do, so he can't give it up. As Dong-hoon walked down the street, his attention was drawn to the announcer's voice coming from one of the street screens. The announcer says that there are currently 37 rankers in South Korea, and one of them is a Dark Lord who became a ranker in just 3 years of active life. The announcers are amazed that the necromancer was able to rise so quickly, which speaks of his exceptional strength. They are glad that in their country there is such an outstanding person whom they have the right to call their necromancer. Dong-hoon looks surprised at first, but after hearing their words, he bites his lip in anger. The necromancer knows the guy the announcers are talking about, and he is very angry about the fact that he received his power on the same day as Dong-hoon himself. The guy is very annoyed by the fact that he can only summon skeletons until death, while the other Dark Lord has already become a ranker. Standing in the middle of the street and listening to this show, Dong-hun became angry at the injustice of this world. When the guy manages to calm down, he heads to a place far from people. We see him walking through the forest, and after some time he comes out into a clearing with mannequins. Dong-hun wipes the sweat from his forehead and sighs, realizing that this is all reality, so anything is possible. Despite the fact that he can only summon skeletons, the guy believes that he cannot be offended by reality and not try to fix it. Standing in front of the targets, Dong-hun raises his staff and orders all the skeletons to come out. The skeleton summoning skill has several effects, the first of which is that it costs 10 energy and can summon up to 10 skeletons at once. The second effect surprised Dong-hun greatly when he learned about it, as it allows each skeleton to be named. When the necromancer read about this ability, he thought that it might be something special and different from others. However, now the young man understands that he was too inspired and did not want to face the truth. Dong-hun tells the skeletons that he is glad to see them and orders them to stretch to take care of their weak tendons. The skeletons immediately obey their master and begin to rattle their bones, warming up. Dong-hun manages to summon the same skeletons over and over again despite using his skills multiple times. The necromancer distinguishes his skeletons by the weapons they come to him with. So Kostian's one weapon is a huge sword. Kostian 2, who is attacking the target at this moment, is armed with a long spear. Kostian 3, at this time, is a little further away from the others and is practicing archery. Dong-hun stands over them like a warden and orders them to continue training. The guy sits down on the grass at a distance so that he can see the training ground. The necromancer thinks that in the beginning he put in a lot of effort in training and even saw some results. For example, before his skeletons could not fight goblins, but now they can give them a worthy rebuff. It is now no problem for them to fight 3 goblins at once. However, despite constant training, the skeletons did not cease to be E rank, and even with a C rank teacher, they would not become stronger. Dong-hun rests his head on his hand and watches his skeletons, saying that he has a very sad life. But he still can't do anything about it, because the curse cannot be avoided. The necromancer recalls being told that he who lives without a dream is more pitiful than he who holds a dream that he can never realize. However, Dong-hun, lost in thought, does not notice the danger lurking in the bushes not far from him. Hearing a growling sound, the guy turns back, trying to see the source. Finally, he manages to spot the threat from the shadows and his eyes widen sharply. Realizing that he has been noticed, the green monster begins to emerge from the ambush, appearing before the necromancer's eyes in full growth. A huge orc, its yellow eyes flashing, comes out to meet Dong-hun. The necromancer freezes in place, not believing his eyes. The guy turns away with horror in his eyes. He doesn't understand what the orc could have forgotten here. Dong-hun receives information from the system that his skeletons are being suppressed by the presence of a strong creature, so their stats are reduced by 20%. The necromancer turns to them and says that they are completely useless. The orc inevitably approaches the guy, while he realizes that the presence of the monster means that a dungeon breakthrough has occurred nearby. A dungeon breach refers to a phenomenon where an uncleared dungeon breaks down and releases monsters. Dong-hun looks at the orc who raises his axe over him. He only thinks that he can't die so easily. The necromancer turns to his skeletons in a panic and calls on them to block the attack, hoping that it will help. Kostian 1 appears between the orc and Dong-hun and blocks the axe blow with his sword. The monster looks at Kostian 1 with a growl and sees that the sword is shaking from the tension. However, after a moment, the skeletons begin to disappear from the battlefield, causing even the orc to be surprised. Dong-hun receives a message from the system stating that Kostian 1 and Kostian 2 have been recalled. Cursing, the necromancer turns on the spot and runs deeper into the forest, hearing that the monster is heading after him. The necromancer hears a strange sound behind him and, turning around, notices that an arrow has hit the orc. Dong-hun remembers that the system did not report Kostian 3, and now the necromancer looks at him with hope, hoping that he will be able to protect him. The guy hides behind a tree and thinks that he has 70 units of energy left, so he can summon 7 more skeletons. The necromancer once again summons Kostian 1 and Kostian 2 to the battlefield, losing 20 units of energy in the process. Dong-hun comes out from behind a tree and orders the first and second to be tanks and the third to attack from behind. The orc deals a powerful blow to the skeletons approaching him, and they are unable to withstand his blows. The necromancer realizes that he will not be able to win this way and turns around, preparing to run away. The orc's axe easily chops the skeletons apart, while Dong-hun summons them again and again. In an attempt to survive, Dong-hun loses track of time. The necromancer is already tired and sweating, but he does not give up. The orc finds him standing behind a tree and begins to inevitably approach. The system issues a warning that the necromancer has used up all his energy and needs to rest to replenish it. The road to the necromancer is blocked by the remaining 3 skeletons, and the guy understands that this is his last chance. The orc lets out a menacing growl and looks at the necromancer with his yellow eyes, ignoring the skeletons. Dong-hun looks back at him with despair and thinks that this is the end for him. However, unexpectedly, the system notifies him about reaching the conditions, and the guy decides to check it, because there will be no more opportunities. The system reports that the guy has achieved the hidden condition of the cursed necromancer, which is to use skeletons 10,000 times. Dong-hun has fulfilled the condition, and his rank is promoted to D rank, and he will soon receive the rewards associated with the promotion. The guy looks at the system that pops up in anger and demands that it give him his rewards faster. The moment the orc raises his axe, the system notifies that the necromancer's energy has been fully restored. Also, the summon of a normal E-rank skeleton has changed to the summon of a normal D-rank skeleton. Kostian One's sword is filled with power, and he successfully resists the orc's blow, causing Dong-hun to realize that the Kostian's power is now completely different. Since the necromancer's energy has been fully restored, he decides to use the new skill immediately. Dong-hun summons 2 D-rank skeletons, Kostian 4 and Kostian 5, at a cost of 20 energy. The system notifies that the skeleton's primary weapon has been selected. We see that a shield appears in the hands of one of them, and a staff appears in the hands of the second. Dong-hun looks at them in surprise and understands from their weapons that Kostian 4 is a tank and Kostian 5 is a mage. Watching the battle unfold, the necromancer realizes that all 5 skeletons are a balanced team. Kostian 4 turns towards the orc and carefully watches the battle between Kostian 1 and Kostian 2. After waiting for a moment, he heads towards the orc like a tank, demolishing everything in its path. The monster is distracted from Kostianov and turns its attention to the approaching Kostian 4. Not expecting anything serious, the orc seems to smirk at his attempt to attack. The monster points his axe towards Kostian 4 and hits the shield with all his might. However, the axe immediately flies off the shield, falling out of the orc's hands. The monster looks at Kostian 4 in amazement and does not notice that a light appears above his head. At that moment, when the glow is impossible not to notice, the orc raises his head up and sees a huge fireball above him. This level 1 fireball was summoned by Kostian 5 and is his skill. A ball of fire falls on the monster, setting it on fire, and Kostian 2, waiting for the moment when the orc was distracted, pierces him with a spear. The monster falls to the ground dead and the fire slowly begins to die out, causing Dong-hun to breathe a sigh of relief. The necromancer looks at his team of skeletons and the system gives him a notification that he has defeated a strong orc. Dong-hun looks at the results of the fight in shock and says that he thought his life was hanging by a thread. However, looking at the defeated orc, he now experiences completely opposite feelings. The necromancer thinks that the world does not want him dead yet, and a smile spreads across his face. At this point, Dong-hun decides to end his training and returns home. He decides to have a snack of ramen and at the same time reads about his new capabilities in the system. The system shows that he is now a D-rank cursed necromancer. He can still only summon skeletons, but their rank has been increased to D. The guy is encouraged that his efforts have been rewarded. Dong-hun continues to eat, thinking that he doesn't know when he'll be able to reach C rank, but he's still happy with what he has. The guy smirks as he wipes his mouth and thinks he needs to get back to basics. The necromancer remembers that the skeleton's strength was quite impressive, and now he wonders how much stronger they can become. Dong-hun imagines whether Kostian 1 can summon a blizzard, and whether Kostian 1 and Kostian 2 can become masters of the sword and spear. The necromancer leans back in his chair and sets this goal before himself. The next day, Dong-hun arrives at work and overhears a conversation between 2 employees, one of whom says he is unhappy with his job. The guy says that with such a salary, he would even volunteer to be a porter to gain experience. Dong-hun looks at the guy and sees a green badge on him, which means the guy is a high-ranking C-rank hunter. However, the necromancer is distracted by a voice calling him. Dong-hun's boss approaches him from the side, happy to see the necromancer and saying that he has good news. The man sits down at his workstation and asks if the necromancer knows about the Parang Guild, which was founded by Gi Parang. Dong-hun answers positively, because who might not know about the prestigious guild that Beautiful Bow created? The boss says that the guild is going to explore a new dungeon and they need porters and that they pay well for it. The man raises his hands and gestures to show a number, saying that they will pay 10 times the stated amount. Dong-hun looks at his boss in shock and, as if not believing his ears, asks him again. The man says that they even accept E ranks and says that all other requests are nothing compared to this one. Dong-hun begins to suspect that things can't be that simple, so he says that he wants to see what kind of dungeon this is first. The boss opens the map using the system and says that this is a newly opened dungeon and it is quite difficult. He also reports that 5 teams have already failed to pass it, and this information leaves Dong-hun in shock. Due to this, the rank of the dungeon is not defined. All the previous teams that tried to pass it were newbies, but this time the famous Parang enters the picture. The chief says it is impossible to imagine a situation in which something could go wrong because the porters do not take part in the battle. The man waves the order sheet in front of Dong-hun and tells him that he just needs to do his job and get paid. The necromancer is in no hurry to sign the papers and is thinking about what he should do. He realizes that the 10-fold reward is most likely due to the price of danger in an unspecified dungeon. Dong-hun himself understands that he is mentally exhausted after yesterday's meeting with the orc. However, the order sheet in the boss's hands continues to beckon him. He remembers that the Dark Lord said that if someone wants to increase their rank faster, they should go to a dungeon above their level. The higher the rank, the greater the risk. But it also means an abundance of opportunities and rewards. Dong-hun makes a decision and agrees to this job, takes the sheet of paper with the contract from the hands of the boss and hears praise from him. The necromancer signs the papers and asks when they are planning to leave and is told that they will leave in a week from Paju Station. After finishing filling out the form, Dong-hun hands the papers to his boss and says that he wants to take a week off. The boss lets him go on vacation and says that he will treat the necromancer to food, and in response, he asks for a double portion. On his week-long vacation, Dong-hun wants to spend time training with his new skeletons. Returning to the field, the necromancer summons 5 skeletons onto the field using his staff. With tears in his eyes, the boy realizes that this is not like the old days at all and his training has paid off. Dong-hun looks at his skeletons and thinks that they will become stronger and stronger. The guy hopes that this way he can become a ranker, so he calls on Kostian 1 and 3 to take their places. The necromancer orders them to attack, wanting to see what D-rank skeletons are capable of. Kostian 1 delivers a powerful blow to the target and cuts through the thick wooden base in an instant. Kostian 2 delivers an equally powerful blow, sending a column of sand into the air. Taking aim, Kostian 3 shoots the bow and the arrow flies forward. The next moment, she passes right through several nearby trees. Dong-hun watches them in surprise and thinks that the skeletons are too strong to be D-rank and are more like C-rank. Even during the battle with the orc, the necromancer realized that the skeletons had become stronger. But he didn't think it was that much stronger. Dong-hun looks at the now broken targets and thinks that he needs to change his training equipment, since the wooden dummies are now useless. With pain in his soul, the necromancer realizes that he will have to spend even more money on training. However, despite this, he is glad that the skeletons have become stronger. But Dong-hun considers himself to be the main problem. After all, he doesn't know how to protect himself if a powerful monster decides to choose him instead of the skeletons. In that case, it won't matter to him how strong his skeletons are because the hunt will start for him. Suddenly, the guy's attention is drawn to something strange. Kostian 5 stands opposite him and clicks his jaw, twirling his staff from side to side. The pink stone on the staff begins to glow, creating a fog around itself. Kostian 5 pulls out his staff, pointing it towards Dong-hun, causing the boy to become scared. However, the next moment, he feels as if a breeze is enveloping him, rushing through his entire body. The necromancer wonders if Kostian 5 could read his thoughts, and he, as if in confirmation, begins to click his jaw. The guy covers his mouth with his hand in surprise and mentally asks the skeleton if he really can read his thoughts. Kostian 5 raises his hand up, showing a thumbs up, and the necromancer is amazed that before they only followed his orders, but now they can express their opinions. Dong-hun wonders what kind of air shield appeared around him and if it is Kostian 5's skill in addition to the fireball. At this time, Kostian 4 comes up to him from behind and hits the ground with his shield with force. This action attracts the necromancer's attention, and he turns, looking questioningly at Kostian. He leans towards Dong-hun and starts clicking his jaw just like the magician did earlier. Seeing that the necromancer does not understand him, Kostian 4 points his finger towards the chopped-up mannequins. Dong-hun looks at the mannequins in shock, not understanding what the skeleton is trying to tell him. Kostian decides to show by example and, stepping aside, puts his shield forward. Kostian 1 starts to strike, which are successfully blocked by the shield. Arrows begin to rain down from above, but the skeleton notices the approaching threat in time. With his shield raised above his head, Kostian 4 does an excellent job of defending himself. After the test fight, the skeleton with the shield remains unharmed, as if demonstrating his skills to the necromancer. Donghun finally understands what they were trying to convey to him and says that it looks solid. In addition to protection, Kostian 4 can serve as a training target, which will reduce training costs. While Kostian 4 and Kostian 1 are training with each other, Donghun orders Kostian 2 to attack him. The necromancer wants to test the strength of the air shield, so Kostian 5 uses his skills, which the system immediately notifies about. The moment the spear approaches the air shield and hits it, Donghun subconsciously closes his eyes, afraid of being hit. However, no matter how long he waits, nothing happens. Opening his eyes, he sees that the shield is blocking all attacks and says with a grin that this is very good. The necromancer claps his hands to attract the attention of all the skeletons and tells them to continue training. This time they switch places a little, and now Kostian 1 is trying to break through the necromancer's shield, while Kostian 2 and 4 are practicing attacks and defense. Under the effect of the air shield, Donghun makes no attempt to dodge and thinks that the training is going well. At this moment, a notification comes that the strength of Kostians 1, 2, and 3, the constitution of Kostian 4, and the magic power of Kostian 5 have increased by 1 unit. The system reports that the first growth after waking up has unlocked the status window. A window pops up in front of Donghun with Kostian 1's status, displaying his powers and abilities. After a few seconds, 4 more windows appear, corresponding to each Kostian individually. Based on the data, Donghun concludes that Kostian's 1, 2, and 3 scores are different because they trained much longer. The necromancer is glad that his efforts were not in vain and thinks about the need to develop them in a comprehensive manner. The guy rolls up the system and turns to his skeletons. They stand opposite, frozen, awaiting further instructions like a loyal team of allies. Donghun looks at them with inspiration and decides that he will make them into the strongest skeletons in the world. After a week, the necromancer, in accordance with his contract of employment, arrives at Paju Station. He took a backpack with the bare necessities on the hike and is now waiting for the other expedition members. While he languishes in anticipation, the guy decides to check his supplies to make sure he hasn't forgotten anything. Opening his bag, he says out loud that he took a sleeping bag and enough food for emergencies. Donghun sees people starting to gather near the station. On this expedition, he will be a porter, so with his backpack on his back, he heads closer to the crowd. From the heights comes the voice of a young man who notifies the mercenaries to gather at the entrance to the dungeon because they plan to enter all at once. The entrance to the dungeon emits a dim energy that is visible within a radius of 200 meters from the station. Donghun notices that the hole that was inside looks like a normal dungeon that appeared naturally. Seeing the entrance to the dungeon, the mercenaries become worried because it looks like a high-difficulty dungeon. They made this conclusion based on the fact that the thicker the color around the entrance, the higher the chance that the dungeon will be more difficult. However, soon the mercenaries calm down because they understand that Parang will be with them. But their conclusion doesn't seem true to Donghun because they can't be safe just because they have a large guild with them. The necromancer understands that all this is nothing more than nonsense. The world they live in has many dungeons and countless hunters who have disappeared into them. It's hard to even imagine how many victims and deaths are overshadowed by the luxurious spotlights of the rankers. But Donghun only tightens his grip on the straps of his backpack and is fully determined to go inside. He is ready to put his life on the line and risk everything to achieve success. The necromancer does not notice that a girl with dark hair is approaching him from behind. The boy turns around sharply when he hears a female voice asking for forgiveness. However, turning back, Donghun does not notice anyone and begins to think that he heard a voice. But a second later, he hears that voice again, saying that the energy the girl is feeling is D rank. The voice is confused by the fact that the plate on the guy's field suit indicates E rank and, moreover, the guy is a porter. The necromancer keeps looking around, trying to find the source of the voice, but to no avail. The voice asks him who he is, but Donghun ignores the question and asks the same one in return. A female voice asks why the boy decided to hide his abilities from Parang and decided to participate as a porter. Donghun despairs of finding the source of the voice and, frozen in place, thinks about how the girl was able to notice such details. Having received no answer to her questions, the girl says that his rank does not matter because there are already many A-rank hunters in the squad. The necromancer looks angry and insulted, but the voice says that he may be a spy who has taken acting classes. Finally, a girl appears in front of the guy who takes off the invisible fabric. She says that Donghun is being too casual about Parang's intelligence capabilities, thinking that she won't notice that he is a spy from another guild. When the girl appears in front of him as if from thin air, the necromancer opens his mouth in shock. Dong-hun notices a gold plate on the girl's belt, which is only given to S ranks and above. Comparing his observations with his existing knowledge, the necromancer concludes that the person standing before him is Gi So-yul, the Dark Empress, one of the 37 rankers of South Korea. Dong-hun begins to shake from the realization that the person standing in front of him is the head of the Parang Guild and Gi Parang's only younger sister. The girl is famous for her unique ability to kill and the fact that she is very scary. The necromancer is not afraid of her, but is genuinely delighted that he has had the chance to communicate with the ranker he admires so much. But the next moment, the guy realizes what he is being accused of, and he tries to explain himself to the girl. Dong-hun says that he is only a D rank and can't be a spy from another guild, since they wouldn't use such a hunter. After his words, the girl looks even more angry and it seems like clouds are gathering over her. But a second later, a smile appears on her face and she grins. She raises her hands up and with a smile on her face says that she was just joking. Dong-hun is in a state of shock and looks at the girl, sweating. The necromancer looks at the cheerful girl and thinks about why someone of her class would play a prank. A crowd of people gathers around the girl, watching what is happening with interest. Dong-hun thinks that the girl might have inquired about him, since skeleton training can attract a lot of attention. In any case, the guy believes that God has given him the opportunity to earn the ranker's attention. Soil approaches the guy and asks if he was upset because she approached him so abruptly. The girl bows her head and apologizes for her behavior, leaving Dong-hun stunned. Soil says that she found it interesting that an E-rank porter could contain 5 D-rank energies. The necromancer remembers that he can summon as many as 5 skeletons at once, so he doesn't find her actions strange. However, suddenly he comes to the realization of how the girl was able to find out about his abilities. She was able to sense his power through energy detection. Soil seemed to catch his train of thought, causing a smile to blossom on her lips. The girl says her older brother asked her to join the second team's expedition as a scout, so she was looking for a porter. At that moment, she saw a suspicious porter in the person of Dong-hun, and she decided to check him out. Soil comes closer to the guy and asks if he wants to volunteer, despite the fact that it may be dangerous. The girl says that with Dong-hun's skills, he should be the most capable among the porters. The girl's gaze becomes cold, and she adds that he doesn't look like a man who would get scared and run away. Soil's gaze scared Dong-hun a little, and he asked her, sweating profusely, if she really thought so. The girl pats the necromancer on the shoulder and says that she knows how to understand people. Soil remembers about the reward and shows the guy 2 fingers, saying that she will pay double. Dong-hun is very surprised by this, because in addition to gaining expedition experience with the ranker, he will also receive double the reward. As soon as the girl asks if Dong-hun agrees to be her porter, the guy raises his hand and agrees. The guy looks at her confidently and thinks that he cannot miss such an opportunity. Returning our attention to the dungeon entrance, we learn that the dungeon rank ranges from E to S. This rank is not determined by the system, so humanity had to subjectively evaluate and determine it. Once in an interview, Ranker White Shadow said that no one can know the rank of a dungeon in advance. It can only be found out by entering it. It was he who gave the advice to look at the brightness of the color surrounding the dungeon. The darker it is, the higher the rank. But his words were not 100% accurate, so the Hunters Association had to set a standard. It consists of the fact that if 5 or more hunters of the same rank cannot pass it, then the rank of the dungeon increases. Thus, if 5 or more A-rank hunters participated in the clearing but failed, then the dungeon becomes S rank. However, the worst thing about this method of determination was that in the end, this method inevitably required someone to sacrifice something. The dungeon that Dong-hun was about to enter was one of those. But even S-rank hunters don't act rashly, so they sent out a reconnaissance team first. Thanks to this, Dong-hun was able to feel the air of the dungeon faster than the other mercenaries. When a necromancer passes through the gate, the system notifies him that he has entered a dungeon. The first thing that catches the guy's eye is stalactites with water dripping from them, which makes it clear that he is in a cave. The group's view was not obstructed by the luminescent pearls that illuminated their path. One of the participants says that they could collect the pearls and sell them for a profit, but the other guy urges him to be careful and not touch everything. Soil walks in front of the group and looks relaxed, making Dong-hun feel like everyone is doing well. This is not surprising, because in the squad, in addition to S-rank Soil, there is also a hunter with an A-rank mark. After some time, Soil tells the rest of the squad not to relax and to be more attentive. She gives orders based on which Swift Blade and Little Fire will survey the surrounding area for 1 cycle. Soyul turns around and asks the guide, Kang Sung-wook, to come over. The man who was previously following Dong-hoon comes out to meet her and asks what she wanted from him. She orders him to look for an exit and cover the porter, to which the man replies that he expected such an order. The man doesn't look like a hunter, but he is confident in his abilities and says that if he doesn't do this, he can no longer be called a guide. An unusual nickname, given to this man by the system due to his exceptional ability to find his way around dungeons. When Soyul finished giving instructions, she turned towards the passage and said that they needed to hurry up and get going. The guide approached Dong-hun from behind and asked if he was nervous, and the necromancer didn't lie and honestly admitted that he was a little worried. The man seemed friendly to the guy at first, but his face immediately changed and he told him to continue to be nervous. Dong-hun didn't understand the guide's quick change of mood and asked him again what he was talking about. The man reports that there are more than 1 or 2 suspicious things in this dungeon. Based on the behavior of the Dark Empress, who is a ranker, the guide concluded that there was some kind of danger around. The strange thing is that the dungeon is too quiet and the structure is simple, and there is a high probability that there will be no monsters here. The guide made these conclusions based on the fact that if there was someone, even a small one, in this cave, then there should be noise or vibration. Therefore, the man believes that there might be something hidden in the cave. Dong-hun sincerely admires the guide's knowledge in this area, and he says that he has been doing this for many years. The man tells the necromancer to follow him and try to find a way out, as Soyul ordered. At this point, their paths diverge from the other 3 hunters, but in Dong-hun's opinion, everything should be fine. In silence, broken only by the sounds of footsteps, the guide and the necromancer move deeper into the cave. Suddenly, the man stops and says that he noticed something strange. The guide turns to the porter and asks if he feels any heaviness in his body, or if it is just the man who feels it. Dong-hun says he has goosebumps and asks the guide if he is sure they should continue on. The man looks into the depths of the tunnel and says that he is not sure either, because this is the first time he has felt this way. The guide says that even meeting a ranker didn't make him feel this way, which makes Dong-hun surprised. The man expresses his suspicions that some kind of ridiculous creature may be here. Remembering that the porter was a necromancer, the guide told him to summon something to be protected in case of danger. Dong-hun gives in to the mood swirling in the air and grips his staff tightly. The staff in the guy's hands begins to glow. 5 skeletons appear in the tunnel at once. The system notifies Dong-hun that he has used up 50 units of energy. The guide looks at Kostyanov doubtfully and asks if the guy can summon something better. The necromancer feels insulted and replies that he can only summon them. Suddenly, the man's eyes widen as if in fear. The tunnel begins to fill with fog and the guide and necromancers cover their mouths, followed by the skeletons. The man rushes forward, saying that there is open ground ahead, but Dong-hun doesn't understand why they would move towards it. The guide says he doesn't know, but he feels the presence of several creatures, and if there is someone there, then this place is suitable for life. These creatures could be either previous hunting parties or monsters, but they have no choice. Covering their airways to avoid inhaling the fog, the team moves deeper into the tunnel. Dong-hun feels that the fog not only makes it difficult to breathe, but also prevents him from keeping his eyes open. Because of this, weakness begins to appear in the necromancer's body, and his legs begin to shake. Kostyan 5 reads Dong-hun's mind and decides to use an air shield on him. However, the next moment, the staff flies out of his hand and the system notifies that the air shield has been broken. The necromancer's mind becomes clouded and he begins to cough up blood. Dong-hun realizes that he can't go any further on his own, so he calls Kostyan 1 over to him. Kostyan gives the necromancer the opportunity to rely on himself, and at that moment, Dong-hun thinks that the pressure is so strong that it can instantly destroy the skill. The guy looks ahead and sees the guide running ahead as fast as he can, leaving him to his fate. Dong-hun thinks that all this doesn't make sense because this dungeon appeared only recently, but it has already managed to make the rankers worry. The necromancer clenches his teeth and thinks that he really wants to live, because he hasn't yet managed to become a ranker. Each step becomes more and more difficult for the guy, but soon his boot hits some kind of barrier. As soon as the necromancer passes through the barrier, his lungs fill with air. The system receives a notification that Dong-hun has reached the stage of an elderly man with white hair, filled with deep resentment. The necromancer does not understand what all this could mean and begins to look around. He still leans on Kostyanov and carefully reads the notice. The system reports that the elderly man's resentment is so deep that icy frost is forming on his hair. A system window appears next to the door and informs that the necromancer needs to enter the room and defeat the old man. Finally, Dong-hun realizes that the white-haired old man is the boss of this dungeon. From somewhere outside, a voice is heard, which is very surprised to see people. The guide and necromancer see a small group of people, one of whom jumps to his feet and asks if they are a reinforcement team. Dong-hun guesses that these people ended up here just like them, trying to escape the pressure in the tunnel. A young man from the Lost team sees the purple A-rank badge on the guide's belt and can't contain his joy. Having noticed the Kostyanovs, the hunters guess that one of them is a necromancer, so they think that a rescue expedition has come for them. The hunter jumps up on the spot and asks to save them, but first to give them some water and food. The guide turns to Dong-hun and says that first they need to feed them. With an indignant expression on his face, the necromancer takes off his backpack and thinks about how upset he is that the man abandoned him and ran ahead. Dong-hun takes out water and snacks from his backpack, convincing himself that this is what the guide should have done since they are in a dungeon. Having received the long-awaited water, the hunters immediately begin to drink it, in an attempt to quench their thirst. They sit in a circle and eat the bars that Dong-hun gave them with gusto, washing them down with water. The necromancer looks at them and thinks that if he had made even one mistake, he would have found himself in their place. The guide, meanwhile, watches as the starving hunters devour their food and encourages them to take their time and eat more slowly. Leaning closer to the hunters, the man asks them if they can explain what happened here. The young man who first spoke to the guide and necromancer when they arrived says he will speak on behalf of his team. The guy shows his badge and says that he is B rank, and also the highest ranked among the survivors. He says that this place is a real hell, and he has never encountered such a strange dungeon in his life. The guide asks why the dungeon seems strange to the guy, and he says that there is no way out, to which the man agrees. The hunter says that from the very beginning, no matter which way the hunters go, they come to the same place. The cursed cave leads all travelers to only one door, which the guide and Dong-hun noticed as soon as they arrived. The aura firmly binds all those who arrive and does not allow them to leave here. The guy is shaking with fear and says that their only way out is to challenge what is behind that door. However, the difficulty level is so high that no one can beat it. An elderly man with white hair, full of deep resentment, is insane and cannot be defeated. Even though there were D, C, and B rank hunters among them, they were like babies in front of this old man. But in the eyes of the young man, there is hope that the guide will be able to defeat the enemy, because he is an A rank. The hunters look at the man with inspiration and hope, but he does not answer them. However, something in Dong-hun's head doesn't add up, and he asks the hunters to wait a little. The necromancer asks them how it is that the boss is so strong, but they are still alive. However, the young hunter is not embarrassed by this question, and he says that this is what is so amazing about it. The old man does not kill people, but only accepts applicants. The hunter says that the old man is conducting some kind of test, but the other participants interrupt him. They say they did not understand the exact details of the so-called test because the old man simply beat them. After this, the old man stood over the defeated and beaten hunters and clicked his tongue. His last words before throwing the hunters out the door were that they were no good. With one wave of his hand, the old man threw the hunters out of the room. Dong-hun looks towards the door in surprise and doesn't understand what kind of dungeon this is where the boss doesn't kill. The leader of the hunting party says that this looks very strange, because the old man is an old man, which means he is still a man. However, during the entire existence of the New World, not a single dungeon had a human as its boss. Dong-hun doesn't understand how the boss can be human and doesn't know if such a thing is even possible. The necromancer believes that they must open this door anyway and complete the task to find a way out. But the guy doesn't trust Kang Seon-wook because he's a hunter with a specialty as a guide. Dong-hun puts his hand to his chin and tries to come up with a plan of action. Suddenly, Soil's voice, who came with the rest of the intelligence team, is heard from the entrance and asks the guide what they are doing here. After a brief description of the situation they all found themselves in, the girl also began to think. Soil says that they should go in right now, and judging by the aura, there are survivors there, but she is worried that their aura is too strong. But the girl does not show fear and with a smile on her face, says that they should not sit with folded hands. The hunters who were the first to be trapped began to cry with happiness because they now had a ranker from the parent guild with them. The girl takes her part of the team and a guide with her, telling the porters and guides to stay put. Dong-hun sits down next to the survivors and says that S rank is completely different from A rank. Before entering the door, Soil stops and checks to see if her hair is tied tightly in a ponytail. She grabs the door handle and turns to the rest of the squad, telling them to get ready. She pulls the handle and opens the door, behind which lies impenetrable darkness. With confident expressions on their faces, the hunters boldly approach the boss. Some time passes. Dong-hun sits next to the wall in the cave and waits for the squad to return victorious. Suddenly, loud sounds, similar to a rumble, begin to be heard behind the door, which attracts the attention of the necromancer. Swift Blade and Little Fire find themselves thrown out the door, looking very battered. Following them, Soyul appears, also wounded and thrown out by the boss. The girl falls to the floor and looks very tired. The door, from which the fog was slowly flowing out, slowly closes, making a quiet creak. Dong-hun looks at the scene before him in shock and can't believe it. The hunting party had only entered the door 10 minutes ago, but they had already been thrown back out. The necromancer never thought that an S rank could fail so quickly. Soil staggers up from the ground and angrily asks what the old man's words about her not being suitable mean. The girl calls the porter, who immediately responds and asks what she needs. Soyul extends her hand and tells Dong-hun to give her the top-tier potion from the bag and informs her that she is coming back. The necromancer does not understand why the girl is in a hurry to enter the door again after being beaten just a minute ago. Dong-hun takes out a potion from his bag and asks her if she's sure, and the girl replies that the old man really didn't kill her. He only beat her. The necromancer asks what this means, and Soyul says that she is now determined. She opens the potion jar and says that she must deal with the old man so that he understands whether she is suitable or not. Hearing her words, Dong-hun thinks about whether the phrase is suitable or not, more like a master looking for a disciple. The necromancer begins to suspect that the old man's discontent may be due to the fact that there were no suitable talents. Meanwhile, Soyul drinks the potion in one gulp. She turns and heads towards the door, and without looking, throws the empty bottle towards the porter. This was the beginning of Gi Soyul's endless ordeal. The old man threw the girl out the door again and again, but she did not give up and came back again. Once again, the girl, thrown out the door, lay on the ground and tried to catch her breath. However, there was no fatigue in her gaze. It burned with fire because she was irritated by this situation. The girl says that she thought that the old man only owned a sword, but the last time he used a spear. Soyul gets back to her feet and dusts herself off, saying that she will see who wins in their fight and heads towards the door again. After several unsuccessful attempts, Dong-hun was no longer surprised by anything and simply watched everything from the side. And so the whole day passed, and the girl did not calm down and continued to try to overcome the old man. The second, third, and fourth days passed in the same way, and the girl began to look like a mad person. With a trembling hand, Soyul points to the door and asks how he can be dealt with if he uses magic. Dong-hun sits quietly against the wall and thinks that even if Giparang comes to save her, it will still end very badly. After spending several days in the cave, the boy began to suspect that even 5 rankers would not be able to defeat the old man. Standing in front of the door, the girl says that she now recognizes the old man's strength. She turns to the porter and says that despite this, she will try as long as she lives. After her words, Dong-hun looks at Soyul with admiration and thinks that this is exactly how rankers think. The necromancer takes his staff in his hands and rises from his place. The guy understands the hunters who were unable to clear the dungeon and began to fight. Dong-hun is as upset as they all are. The necromancer clutches his staff in his hand and thinks that he can't just wait here and do nothing. He can't even imagine what kind of power the old man possesses if all the hunters present pass through this door and return back. Dong-hun realizes that he is the only person left who has never visited the old man. Swift Blade notices that the porter has risen from his seat and is heading towards them. Soyul also notices this and turns around, asking Dong-hun what happened. The guy confidently approaches the door and says that he should try it too. The girl looks at him in surprise and doesn't think she misheard. She asks how a porter can cope in a dungeon where even a ranker couldn't cope. One of the hunters tells Dong-hun to continue acting like a porter and not to interfere. Swiftblade is very aggressive towards the necromancer because he finds his behavior offensive. In a fit of anger, he begins to take out his katana, preparing to attack Dong-hun. The necromancer is frightened by such a reaction because he did not want to offend in any way. Soyul stops Swiftblade from attacking the porter and orders them to stop. However, she also looks at Dong-hun with an offended expression and asks if he is doing this because he doesn't trust her. The hunters stand in front of the necromancer, waiting for an answer, separating him from the door. Dong-hun shakes his head from side to side and says that it's not that. Soyul reminds that according to the contract, Dong-hun is a porter and has no right to express his opinion during the mission. The guy says he remembers this condition. The girl asks the necromancer what happened that made him decide to challenge this rule. Dong-hun reminds her that according to the old man, he is looking for a suitable person. The boy thought that his dissatisfaction was due to the fact that he was looking for a worthy student. A worthy disciple must have potential, but he must not be perfect, so the current level of strength is not mentioned. The girl suggests that Donghun wants to become his disciple, not defeat him. The guy nods his head and says that this could be a hidden condition. Almost every dungeon has hidden conditions that provide alternative ways to progress. Donghun's words make the girl think about it. The girl asks how the boy decided to become the old man's disciple and whether he thinks he has more potential than her. Her words make the nearby hunters even more angry. Donghun raises his hands up and says that he has serious doubts about his potential. But the girl comes close to him and reminds him that he did not deny this possibility. The necromancer looks down at the girl and says that she got it all wrong. Donghun tries to explain that everyone present is in pain except him, which makes him feel like the odd one out. The guy also justifies his desire to try by saying that the girl is on a break anyway. After his words, a smile appears on Soyul's face. She turns away from him and says that he has finally shown his true colors. Soyul says she knew it from the beginning, but Donghun doesn't understand what she's talking about. She recalls that she said from the very beginning that he was suspicious because he had eyes like a wolf on the hunt. Soyul asks if the guy wants to get a reward in the dungeon or hopes for a successful meeting during the raid. Donghun looks at the girl and thinks at that moment that she should be a fortune teller, not a ranker. He is amazed at how quickly she can read a person just by looking at them. Soyul moves to the wall and tells Donghun that he can try since there is no other solution anyway, and she wanted to rest. The girl says that she is not one of those people who slanders, because in the end, she also failed. Donghun is surprised that she gave her permission, but Soyul warns him that he only has one try. She draws the necromancer's attention to the fact that rations are running low and they need to deal with this problem as soon as possible. Donghun bows and thanks her for giving her permission. With confidence in his eyes, the guy turns towards the door. He approaches her closely without a shadow of fear. When he touches the door handle with his hand, a message comes from the system. It says that the necromancer can challenge the scene by opening the door and asks if the guy wants to open it. When the door opens, the system reports that a scene has been launched of an elderly man with gray hair, filled with deep resentment. His resentment is so great that icy frost forms in his hair. The system tells Donghun to defeat him, and at that moment, the guy is blinded by a bright light. However, the next moment, Donghun finds himself in a dark room filled with a strange white fog. The necromancer cautiously moves deeper into the room, trying to see something. Suddenly, an old man's laughter comes from the darkness, and Donghun immediately kneels before him. The old man approaches the guy and says that before this a weak girl came to him, and now an even more pitiful person. He raises his hand and says that he doesn't even want to look at the necromancer and will get rid of him now. The gray-haired man's eyes begin to shine a cold blue. Donghun is about to be sent out the door, but the system alerts him that the hidden condition for the cursed necromancer's unique ability has been reached. Donghun met a cursed soul with a strong determination, so he obtains the skill S-rank memory restoration. The necromancer can't believe that he has been granted an S-rank skill and slowly rises to his trembling legs. The old man seemed to be frozen in place, and the system said that Donghun was now using his new ability. The necromancer does not understand how he activated the ability, but notices that the old man threatened to get rid of him, but now does nothing. The system reports that the memory of the cursed soul of the master of all techniques is being recreated, and soon the guy will be transferred. A white light appears, blinding Donghun again, blocking his vision. But unexpectedly, he is attracted by a snowflake that lands neatly on his hand. Raising his head up, the guy looks around in surprise because instead of a cave, he's now on a snowy street. Not far from him, Donghun sees an old man standing alone in the middle of a field covered in snow. The old man asks why there are no suitable candidates. He thinks it is wasteful to leave like this. He feels his life is meaningless because he worked so hard to get to where he is now, but he is asked to give it all up. Donghun's hair is blown by the wind and he looks around, assuming that he has been transported to another world. The necromancer sees only nature and falling snow around him, and he is very surprised that other worlds actually exist. Suddenly, many thoughts come into his head, causing Donghun to shudder. He puts his hand to his forehead, feeling a strong pain, but not physical, but mental. Donghun understands that he feels at this moment the emotions and memories of the old man, who now says that it was an interesting life. The old man was a swordsman, a spearman, an assassin, an archer, a mage, a buffer, a healer, and much more. He says that when you can control the flow of ki, all techniques become one. The old man overcame everything and everyone, lived a very long time, but even ki could not stop his aging. Now for him, drinking cold water is like drinking poison, and the air that was once light seems to press on him, wanting to kill. The old man's hands are shaking and he says that it is very painful and excruciating. But the next second, the old man clenches his fists and says that he cannot just die like that. His gaze fills with anger and he says that it would be too unfair to die now. The old man falls to his knees and says that life is not fair. He just wanted to find at least one student to whom he could pass on this ability. The old man asks why he could not find anyone with sufficient talent to become his disciple. He calls out to heaven and asks for a chance to pass on all his knowledge. The old man screams into the void and says that he can't do this anymore. He says he can't live like this, and a tear runs down his cheek. A lonely tear falls on the pure white snow. The old man leans his hands on the snowy ground and says that he will sell his soul. He will do anything to leave his name behind, and after these words, he falls dead to the ground. The system reports that the memory restoration skill has ended and Dong-hun begins to be pulled out of this dimension. A moment later, he is standing again in the cave opposite the spirit of a gray-haired old man whose hair is covered with frost. Dong-hun seems to emerge from a dream. Looking back, he realizes that he has arrived back at the cave and sees his staff, which he dropped earlier. A white mist comes from the old man's side and begins to press on Dong-hun. Unable to withstand this pressure, the guy falls to his knees and clutches his chest, and the system notifies him that a master of all techniques is looking at him. The guy thinks that it is too stuffy in the cave now and he cannot breathe normally. However, despite this, a smile blossoms on the guy's face. The guy believes that he now has hope. Suddenly, the old man turns to Dong-hun, causing him to flinch. The master understands that the guy has looked into his soul and finds it interesting, and the system notifies that the master is interested in Dong-hun. The necromancer picks up his staff from the floor and, shaking from the weight, lifts it to his feet, confirming the old man's words. This time, Dong-hun knows for sure that the master of all techniques is looking for a student, someone who will inherit his immense power and knowledge. That's why Dong-hun believes that he should be his disciple. The old man raises his hand again and says that other than the guy being a little interesting, he has nothing that would help him withstand the master's techniques. The necromancer falls to his knees again due to the increased pressure. Dong-hun yells at him that if he continues like this, he will never find a student and will forever remain a ghost, unable to cope with his resentment. He warns the master that he will be remembered by everyone as a ghost, full of stubbornness. The master is angered by his words, and he says that he spared such incapable people only because of his boundless generosity. The old man raises his hand and asks if he should break the necromancer's leg to make him realize this. Dong-hun gets scared and raises his hands up, asking the master to wait a bit and listen to him. The guy tells him that the master has mastered all the techniques in the world, while the people of this world try to master at least one in their entire lives. The old man says that this is impossible, because the world is huge and time is eternal, so there will be another genius like him. Dong-hun points to the door and asks if the master can believe that the woman he had before is one of the strongest in the world. The old man lets out a surprised cry, and his reaction hurts Dong-hun a little, since his ultimate goal was to become a ranker like Soil. But despite this, the necromancer is glad that the old man took the bait. The master says that it is impossible, because the girl cannot be the best with such a low level of skill. He thinks that Dong-hun is deceiving him. Dong-hun tells the old man to look into his eyes and tell him if he looks like a dishonest person. The guy tells the master that he should immediately understand whether he is lying or not. After a short silence, the old man says that the guy is telling the truth and is very upset about it. Dong-hun decides to take action and says that if no one meets the master's standards, then he can take him as a student. The old man begins to look at the necromancer, thinking about his offer. The boy gradually begins to get used to the pressure and asks the old man to pass on his abilities to him. The master says that he considers the guy a shameless, impudent fellow and would rather transfer his powers to anyone but him. Dong-hun says that he is not asking to be taught specifically by him. The necromancer opens the system and thinks that he must not make a mistake, so he summons D-rank skeletons. The Kostyans appear before the master, ready to attack at any moment as they sense a threat. Dong-hun says that if the old man is an elder, then he should be able to see the potential in them. The master freezes and silently looks at the skeletons that have appeared for some time. Dong-hun made this call because he believes that evolving skeletons should have limitless potential. The necromancer says that each of the Kostyans has their own unique abilities, so it will be easier for the master to teach them. The old man touches the chest of one of the skeletons and taps it. Dong-hun says that even if the master wants one disciple, after all the Kostyans evolve, the necromancer will be the only one to inherit everything. The guy says that skeletons don't feel pain, so they will have more endurance than anyone else and will fearlessly accept all challenges. The old man listened attentively to Dong-hun the whole time, not daring to say a word. Suddenly, the master turns away from them and moves deeper into the cave. Dong-hun is already starting to think that his plan has failed, causing him to clench his teeth. Moving away, the old man turns to face them and says that all this looks extremely funny. After all, the receiver he had been looking for so long turned out to be not a human, but an undead being with enormous potential. Looking at Kostianwon, the master says that they must have been exceptional warriors in life. He always wanted such people as his students, but it is difficult to teach more than one. The cave seems to dissolve into space, and now they are back on the snowy street, where the master says that he must compromise. At this moment, the system reports that Dong-hun has fulfilled the hidden condition for the scene, an elderly man with white hair, full of deep resentment. The old man appears alive again and asks the necromancer to promise him that he will overcome all trials and inherit everything he owns. The master says that it is Dong-hun who will leave his mark on this world. The system notifies that in order to complete the mission, the necromancer must convince the master, after which the guy says that he will not miss his chance and will inherit everything no matter what. The old man's face finally breaks into a happy smile and he begins to fade into the snowy landscape, while the system congratulates Dong-hun on successfully clearing the stage. Sometime later, the necromancer opens his eyes and sees a white ceiling in front of him. He lies on a hospital bed and tries to understand how he ended up here, because just recently he was standing next to the master. His attention is drawn to a voice that says that the boy has finally woken up. Dong-hun tries to find the source of the voice and sits up in bed asking who is talking to him. Despite the fact that the girl has changed her work clothes for an office suit, the necromancer recognizes Soyul. The guy touches his head with his hand, trying to remember what happened after the master disappeared. This time, the girl wants to introduce herself formally, so she says that she is Gi So-yul, the vice guildmaster of the Parang Guild. She also calls her hunting nickname, the Dark Empress. Dong-hun thinks that he already knows who she is, but he doesn't understand why she is in his hospital room. The necromancer suggests that he may have lost consciousness after clearing the dungeon. Soyul says that she was very surprised because she thought that the boss was impenetrable. She looks at Dong-hun suspiciously and says, "Who would have thought that the porter would be the one to clear this dungeon?" The necromancer is frightened by her gaze, which makes him shudder and pull the blanket higher. Dong-hun asks Soyul why she is looking at him so strangely. He holds his hand out in a defensive gesture and says that he simply wants to know why the deputy guildmaster of one of the largest guilds has come to see him. Soyul is silent for a while, but then says that she was just very curious. She sits down next to him and asks how the guy passed this absurd test and what reward he received. The girl asks if the boy really became the old man's disciple. Dong-hun believes that her questions are valid since the dungeon belonged to her and he was only given one opportunity. In her opinion, he is just a random guy who stole her achievement. Dong-hun thinks that if there had been a more cruel ranker in her place, he would have already beheaded him for stealing his loot. Soyul notices that the necromancer is thinking about something and asks him what exactly he is thinking about. Dong-hun says he will answer her question after she tells him what the news is reporting about this dungeon exploration. Soyul guesses what the guy is worried about and says that all the participants signed a non-disclosure agreement, and the media reports that the dungeon was cleared by the Giparang squad. Dong-hun is pleased to hear that the rest of the people have no idea that he was the one who cleared the dungeon. The necromancer bows to the girl and thanks her for taking care of him. Soyul says that the guy is more mature than he seems, because anyone else would kill for the opportunity to brag about their achievements to the whole world. With a smile, Dong-hun says that safety comes first for him. Soyul says that in that case he shouldn't thank her, because for the Parang Guild it's also a source of pride. She also says that no one will believe that the porter became the main hero of the expedition, and even an E-rank mercenary, not a ranker. With a sad look, the boy understands that the guild only did this because they were embarrassed by the fact that he was the one who cleared the dungeon. Dong-hun wants to ask Soyul something, and she says she's willing to answer his questions. The necromancer asks the girl how long he was unconscious, and she replies that it was about 3 days. The guy is unhappy that he was unconscious for quite a long time, but is nevertheless grateful to Soyul for her help. Dong-hun says that he hasn't had time to figure out the rewards yet, so he can't give the girl an exact answer on this matter. Soyul looks surprised, but still suggests that it might be true. The guy coughs and says that he needs a little more time to come to his senses and figure everything out. Dong-hun assures Soyul that he will not run away, because in their world, it is useless to hide from the Dark Empress. The girl looks at him suspiciously and thinks about what she should do. Deciding to trust, Soyul gets up from her chair and says that she will give him time and come back when he figures everything out. Dong-hun thanks her for the opportunity and she leaves the room. When the door closes behind her, the necromancer leans back on the bed and sighs with relief. The guy thinks that his life has been very exciting lately. The most important thing for him now is that he can become an ally with Parang or end up on the wrong side. Suddenly, the necromancer realizes that he fainted before he could check the rewards. The guy presses the accept button and sees that his energy level has increased by 20 units, and he has also received a skill, learning all S-rank techniques. Dong-hun looks at his card and sees 2 techniques that are already S-rank. Now the guy understands why veterans are so obsessed with dungeons, because such rewards are very nice to receive. One of the effects of memory restoration is reading the memories of the dead, but the guy doesn't know how to use it. He hopes to master it perfectly in the future and continues to watch the awards. Training in all techniques has several conditions. He can call the master for 60 minutes once every 24 hours. Only the necromancer can see the master, so the master cannot harm other people. After finishing reading, Dong-hun gets out of bed and goes to his backpack. The guy decides not to hesitate and check out all the new possibilities, so he gets dressed and leaves the hospital for the training ground. Dong-hun looks at his hand as if he's thinking about something. After this, he extends his palm forward and makes a call. The system notifies that the necromancer has used the skill, training in all S-rank techniques. A large glowing circle, similar to a portal, appears in front of Dong-hun. After a couple of seconds, he sees the master standing opposite him with his hands folded. Now the old man looks the same as he did in life, and there is no longer a sense of threat. So he tells Dong-hun that he called him at the most opportune moment. The master looks very happy, so the necromancer greets him with a smile on his face. However, the next moment, the old man hits Dong-hun on the head and calls him an idiot. The boy sat down on the ground in pain, and the master began to scold him for not calling him for so long, despite the promise to inherit his power. The old man's forehead is bulging with anger, and he says that if the boy is so lazy, he won't be able to stand his instructions. Dong-hun clutches his aching head and justifies himself by saying that he called the master as soon as he came to his senses. However, something makes the guy think, namely that the old man cannot influence the world around him. But how could he hit him? His thoughts are interrupted by his mentor, who says that the boy has a long way to go because his facial expression is easy to read. The old man says that he and the necromancer are mentally connected, so he won't have any problems hurting the guy. Not wanting to waste time, the master calls Dong-hun to start training, and the boy mumbles in response. The boy asks if he should summon the skeletons now, but the old man stops him. He says that first they need to decide what the guy himself will do, because the talents of skeletons are already clear. The mentor points his finger at Dong-hun and says that the problem lies with him. The guy thinks to himself why he is the problem. The old man steps aside and asks if Dong-hun knows why he is called the master of all techniques. He says he got this nickname after studying and perfecting countless talents. The old man says that the necromancer will have to learn all the techniques that are not suitable for skeletons. His words and facial expressions send shivers down Dong-hun's spine. The guy shouts at the master and reminds him that he said that his skills are trash. The mentor doesn't like the fact that the guy decided to contradict him, so he stomps his foot hard. He yells at Dong-hun and orders him to shut up, and the boy obeys, afraid of getting hit in the head again. The master points his finger at him and says that since he promised to inherit his skill, then he must do it. His eyes start to light up and he says that the guy will keep trying until he does it. The mentor threatens to use physical force against him, and these words make Dong-hun tremble with fear. The master talks about how he created several arts, but was unable to apply them during his lifetime. The old man says that hardened meridians can be opened with qi, and the body can be improved if massaged for 300 days. The master says that the guy is stubborn, so he can endure it, but the necromancer himself does not look inspired. The guy tries to cool down his mentor, saying that his heart is not ready for this yet. But the old man tells him to shut up and asks if the boy knows how many people from his world want to be his disciples. He talks about his technique, the great technique of the Heavenly Master, and says that he created this art in the last years of his life. Dong-hun thinks that if the old man had such a technique, then why didn't he use it earlier? The mentor understands what he is thinking and hastens to warn that the price for this technique is his life force. If he used this technique to raise his disciple's level, his body would simply melt. Dong-hun asks doubtfully what exactly has changed now that the old man decided to use it. The mentor says that nothing bad should happen since he has already died. Then Dong-hun asks him why he didn't do the same to the other people who came to him. The old man hits the necromancer on the head again, repeating that he is an idiot. The guy clutches his poor head and asks why he was hit again. The mentor says he did this because even when he says something to the guy, he doesn't understand a word. The old man reminds that this technique turns trash into genius, so it doesn't work if you don't use trash. Its use is only useful if the target is at the food waste level. Dong-hun once again receives a portion of insults addressed to him and can no longer listen to it. The mentor remembers Soyul and says that the technique does not work on people who are one level higher. Despite the fact that the guy has the ability to summon the dead, his body did not change from this and remained pure and weak. Moreover, the master considers this only an alternative, because born geniuses are more impressive than created ones. Dong-hun thinks about the fact that his words are not without meaning. The guy thinks that it might not only be the skeletons, but also himself, so he needs to become stronger. The mentor warms up his hands and asks if the guy is ready to start training. Dong-hun is inspired by the fact that he will soon be able to become stronger and the great master will help him with this, so he agrees. However, after just a couple of minutes, terrible screams are heard throughout the forest, scaring away all the birds in the area. Dong-hun slams his hands on the ground and screams that it hurts, begging the master to stop. But the mentor doesn't stop and asks why the guy is screaming like that if he hasn't even started yet and continues to punch him on the back. The guy sets himself up for what he must endure in order to become a ranker. But he is frightened by the master's words that they have only just begun. The mentor continues to punch and says the guy is as stubborn as he said, so he increases the pace. Dong-hun grits his teeth and tries to endure the pain, encouraging himself. A system sign appears in front of him, stating that he has obtained the C-rank pain resistance skill. The master completes the massage with a final, clear blow between the shoulder blades. It becomes the last point for Dong-hun, and he falls to the ground while the master rubs his wrists. The old man says that they are done with this and praises the guy for doing an excellent job. He says the guy has good willpower and perseverance, as well as a desire to become stronger in order to endure all this. The mentor looks at the exhausted and beaten boy and says that not all is lost. Dong-hun finds the strength to sit up and asks the old man if they are done for the day. But the master doesn't understand what he's talking about because they still have half an hour left. The mentor lifts Dong-hun to his feet by the scruff of his neck and asks how he could have thought that he would only enjoy a massage today. The old man points towards the skeletons and says that the undead are waiting for him. The guy's eyes widen as he understands the current situation. He agrees with the master but cannot stop crying and thinks that he wants to die. The mentor stands in front of them and says that the basis of all professions is physical strength, and skeletons can build it up even without having muscles. The master says they will start with proper posture and stands in the horse-riding position he has used throughout his life. The skeletons repeat after the instructor as he says that human muscles are concentrated in the lower part of the body. Dong-hun takes the same position and thinks that the old man has already knocked the wind out of him, and now he is forcing him to stand in this position. The old man approaches the shaking boy and says that he knew from the beginning that the boy had no talent. However, the master points out that the guy definitely has persistence. The mentor says that in addition, the master must not be weaker than the creatures he summons. Dong-hun thinks to himself that this is exactly what he is doing now, but his muscles are already torn from the massage and now they can't recover. The guy doesn't understand what the point of these trainings is, because now it definitely looks like torture. About 30 minutes pass and the training is nearing its end. Dong-hun is very happy about this because he is already lying on the ground, exhausted, suffering from pain. The mentor raises his head to the sky and says that this is where they can finish for today. He orders the necromancer to do this training every morning differently and may not even call upon him. Without getting up from the ground, the guy agrees and the system notifies him that the skill's validity period, training in all techniques, has ended. The system says that the master of all techniques has been recalled and the skill can be repeated again in 24 hours. The guy is unable to move and lies sprawled on the ground as the skeletons approach him, snapping their jaws. Without opening his eyes, Dong-hun calls out to Kostyan-won. He immediately approaches the necromancer and clicks his jaw questioningly. Shaking from the strain, the boy stretches out his arms towards him and asks if Kostyan can carry him. The guy complains that he can't even get home on his own. The next morning, the guy goes to work. Entering the room, the boss greets him loudly, causing the guy to be surprised. The man waves at him from his workplace and asks him to come to him quickly. He points to two hunters standing nearby and asks if the necromancer remembers them, as they are one of the surviving teams in the last dungeon. The guy immediately recognizes them as two hunters who fell into a trap. A guy in a white suit approaches the necromancer and greets him, saying that Dong-hun has changed a bit, as if looking more muscular. The necromancer is surprised by his words. Could he really have started to change so quickly? Without realizing it, The guy realizes that he has actually gained a little weight. Looking at his arms, the boy notices that his shoulders have become wider, as if the structure of the skeleton has changed. Dong-hun thinks that maybe this is the result of the 30-minute massage. But the guy doesn't let joy cloud his eyes, because he doesn't know why these hunters suddenly came for him. Dong-hun decides not to waste time and asks directly what brought them here, and one of the hunters decides that he should introduce himself first. The white-robed hunter extends his hand with a smile and says that his name is Kang Jae-ho, a C-rank hunter, and that Dong-hun's behavior in the dungeon impressed him. Jae-ho says that since they got out alive, he would like to work with the necromancer, after which they shake hands. The guy also decides to introduce himself and says that his name is Ju Dong-hun and he is an E-rank necromancer mercenary. Jae-ho suggests getting down to business and reveals that there is another dungeon. Dong-hun asks what this place is, and the hunter replies that it is a famous C-rank type, and they would like to hire a necromancer. Jae-ho says that they heard that the guy is having financial difficulties, so he agrees to any job. Hearing this, Dong-hun turns his head towards the boss and looks at him angrily. The boss pretends not to notice and turns away, and the necromancer thinks that he deceived the hunters in order to get a job again. Dong-hun sighs and turns back to the hunters, saying that he really does need money right now. Jae-ho is happy to hear this, but warns that this dungeon is not easy for C-rank. He says it's worth a try. If you're lucky, the reward will be good. And besides, someone recently received a strength potion. Dong-hun lets out a surprised cry because the strength potion is a rare reward in the dungeons, regardless of rank. This potion has the ability to cure any curse or disease. Jae-ho asks what Dong-hun thinks about this and warns that this time the guy will not be a porter, but a full-fledged member of the team. The necromancer calms down a little and asks what the payment will be. The guy grins and asks what the guy means by payment. He's not a porter, so he'll get his fair share of the profits. Dong-hun is very surprised by this because he always worked as a mercenary, so he received a fixed amount. In his head, the boy thinks that if the potion were to be sold, its average price would be around 50 million won. If you divide this amount by 6 people on the team, it comes to approximately 8.33 million won per person. Dong-hun's eyes begin to shine with daylight, and he thinks that this will be very good. Jae-ho asks the necromancer if the conditions are attractive to him and if he agrees to join them. Dong-hun agrees, saying that he is already tired of being a porter. He recalls that he would like to see the power of his evolved skeletons in action. Jae-ho shows the meeting place and says that Dong-hun just needs to come there next Monday. On the same day, the necromancer goes to the training field again and summons the master of all techniques. Dong-hun tells him about the dungeons and says that in this world, hunters become stronger because of them. The master says that this is funny, because the necromancer has not yet learned to walk, but already wants to run, and Dong-hun replies that he needs to earn a living. The mentor changes his mind and says he prefers practical experience. Seeing the change in the master's mood, Dong-hun asks if he will be allowed to go. The mentor, with an angry expression on his face, says that in any case, he will not tolerate skipping training. Dong-hun hiccups and the master asks if he was going to use that as an excuse to avoid training. The necromancer promises that he will call the master directly to the dungeon, and having received what he wanted, the mentor says that it is time for them to begin the massage. Dong-hun wanted to delay this time as much as possible, but the old man was not going to wait any longer. Screams of pain are heard again through the forest and the birds leave their places. After the massage, Dong-hun rises from the ground, shaking in pain. The master stands behind him and says that that's enough for today and praises the guy for a job well done. With tears in his eyes, Dong-hun turns to him and thinks about how he almost died again. The system again notifies the guy that the skill pain resistance has improved, and now as the pain increases, the feelings will weaken. The mentor claps his hands and says that the boy has endured everything well. With a pained smile on his face, Dong-hun turns to him and says that it's all thanks to the elder. The coach says he is proud of him, so starting tomorrow they can increase the intensity of their training a little. The joy disappears from Dong-hun's face, and he hopes that he misunderstood the old man's words. But the master doesn't answer and moves away, saying that it's time for them to start training. The elder loudly orders everyone to gather. The skeletons immediately run towards him, rattling their bones. The master points to the lawn and orders everyone to come there and squat down like last time. The old man says that from now on, while they are training their physique, he will teach them one technique every day and asks that he wants to be the first. While the master warms up his hands, Dong-hun tries to understand what exactly this means. The mentor points to Kostyan-won and says that he will be trained with a sword. Kostyan turns towards the necromancer as if asking permission, and he nods in response. Dong-hun tells the elder that this Kostian is a swordsman and has no skills. The mentor says that this is okay, as they can develop his skill as they go. The elder looks at Kostian defiantly and orders him to start swinging his sword. From this look, Kostian becomes frightened and begins to tremble. Dong-hun comes up to him from behind and says that it's okay because this man will make him the greatest swordsman. But the necromancer's gaze changes, and he quietly says that he will have to train until he breaks all his bones. His first words seemed to calm Kostian down, but after the last ones, he began to tremble with fear again. Time goes by and the training goes according to plan. Dong-hun watches as Kostian throws punches, honing his skills, and hears the old man ask if his name is Dong-hun. The guy turns to the mentor and answers in the affirmative. The elder asks him, in Dong-hun's mind, what fencing is. The necromancer says that since it is called fencing, it is a technique that uses a sword. The mentor listened to his answer and said that the guy has a very simple way of thinking. The master says that he is right, because there is no need to think too much about it. The old man picks up his stick and says that fencing skill is simply the ability to handle a sword. He throws a stick towards the necromancer and tells him to pick it up from the ground. Dong-hun looks at the stick lying in front of his feet and understands what the mentor was talking about. The elder wants more than just skeletons to inherit all the techniques. He wants Dong-hun to learn all the techniques along with the skeletons. The boy takes the stick in his hands and the elder tells him to use it. Dong-hun holds the stick in both hands like a sword and asks how he should use it. The elder reminds that the guy should not think about it. He should hold her in a way that is comfortable for him. After a couple of seconds, the master asks if the guy completed his task and he answers positively. The elder tells him to swing as hard as he can, and Dong-hun then follows his order. The master standing behind him praises him with a smile on his face. Dong-hun can't understand what's going on since this isn't something he usually hears from his mentor. The instructor tells Dong-hun to pay attention to the grip of his right hand and asks how it feels. The old man says that the thumb is held firmly up and the other 4 fingers hold it in place. He goes into the pose and says the guy swung once from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock and then again from 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock. The elder says that he hasn't taught Dong-hun anything yet, but he's already doing everything right. The mentor says that the guy swung the way he thought was most comfortable for cutting, and his perception is based on everything he has experienced throughout his life. He says the guy just has to put his whole life into that swing. Dong-hun looks at the stick in surprise and begins to understand what the elder is talking about. The mentor asks the necromancer if he were to add strength and speed to the cut he just made, it would become more powerful. Dong-hun starts to think about his words, and the master says that the guy is making a stupid face again. The mentor says that any cut becomes more powerful if you add strength and speed, and this fact will never change. The boy analyzes the old man's words, looking at the stick in his hand. He grips the stick tighter and thinks that he now understands what he is talking about. The elder wants the boy to create his own cut and then add strength and speed to it. The mentor sees from the guy's face that he understands him and steps aside. He heads towards the sword and asks the boy if he knows what will happen if he repeats the cut millions of times and reaches its peak. The elder takes the sword into his hands without any obstacles. The instructor orders them to watch carefully, because this is the fencing they will learn. The guy looks at his mentor in amazement because this is the first time he sees his abilities. The elder raises his hand to strike, cutting through the air. He then performs a pour, holding the sword in one hand as if it weighed nothing. The sword in the hands of the master moves with amazing speed, so that it is impossible to notice. The mentor says that the boy just needs to make his own cut stronger. If he does it right, eventually everyone will use his cut as a base. Dong-hun looks at the elder with enthusiasm. Now the guy thinks that there is nothing wrong with his awkward posture. It doesn't matter how he swings his sword, he can swing it however he likes, and the system will notify him when he gains a new skill. A young man is sitting at a table in his office and writing something. He has black hair and dark blue eyes, is the guild master of Parang, and is ranked 58th in the world among rankers. They call his name, addressing him as a brother, and this makes the boy look up at the man who entered. Soil stands in front of him with her arms crossed over her chest. Guildmaster Beautiful Bow gets up from his seat and asks what happened to the girl, since she had never come to him before. Soil sits down on the sofa shyly and tells her brother that something has been bothering her lately. A girl asks a boy if a D-rank hunter can suddenly display strength superior to a ranker. The brother is surprised and says that this is a rather strange question, but the girl asks him to answer it. The Beautiful Bow suggests that even if a lucky chance occurs or a skill is learned, it is still very unlikely. The guy believes that even if such a case had happened, the only explanation would be that he was hiding his abilities. However, The girl shakes her head from side to side and says that the man was definitely not pretending. Brother doesn't doubt him because even rankers can't hide their abilities from Soil's eyes. The girl is a ranker and one of her abilities is searching, which belongs to the S rank. Beautiful Onion thinks that this situation doesn't make sense and asks his sister if something special happened. Soil grits her teeth and doesn't know how to get out of this situation. She still hasn't reported to her brother what happened in that very dungeon. The reason is that she cannot admit that she has been defeated many times. She still remembers with horror that white-haired master who was the boss in that dungeon. Soil had never felt so helpless in her life. That's why she's even more surprised by the fact that a D-rank hunter was able to stand up to him. Soil remembers their first meeting and thinks that the first impression was unusual. When they were in the dungeon, the girl was interested in looking at him, so she gave him a chance. Soil folded her hands, resting her chin on them, and thought that the guy really took advantage of this chance. He remembers their conversation at the hospital and thinks that he will wait because Dong-hoon promised to tell her when he sorted everything out. Beautiful Onion, who has been watching his sister all this time, says that she is behaving strangely and used to be serious, but now she is smiling. The brother says that Soyul makes him curious because before the girl didn't care about anything except wielding a dagger. The girl blushes at his words and jumps to her feet, saying that she is going to leave. Beautiful Onion smiles and tells her not to be shy and to talk to her brother, but she runs out of the office in embarrassment. Meanwhile, the squad that Dong-hoon is a part of gathers near the entrance to the dungeon. The two young hunters, already familiar to us, turn to the side, seeing a man approaching them. Dong-hoon waves his hand at them in greeting, and the hunters call him over. Jae-ho approaches the necromancer and asks if he saw the message with the details about the dungeon and receives an affirmative answer. The message stated that the dungeon was a C-rank desert type, and the main mission was to destroy monsters and defeat the boss. Dong-hoon says he followed their advice and applied sunscreen and stocked up on ice water. Jae-ho praises him for this, but the necromancer notices something strange. Dong-hoon notices that there are a few more people near the entrance to the dungeon than he was told. His attention is drawn to two girls, one of whom tells the other that if they go through the gate, they will find themselves in the desert. Jae-ho reassures the necromancer by saying that they hired 2 F-rank porters and already paid them, so Dong-hoon won't be taken. The guy finally calms down and says that he understands everything. He remembers that in order to pick up the ore and items that dropped in the dungeon, they must have porters. Dong-hoon shakes his head, reassuring himself that it's just a C-rank dungeon, so everything will be fine. He is comforted by the fact that skeletons can defeat an orc, a D-rank supreme being, in the blink of an eye. With his mind set on the best, Dong-hoon passes through the gate following the team. A few seconds later, he finds himself in the desert, just as Jae-ho had told him earlier. Dong-hoon steps onto the sand and the system notifies that the boy has entered the dungeon. The sun is shining brightly high in the sky, and the system warns that he is being exposed to a harsh environment. The necromancer looks up to the sky and hears from the system that his stats have dropped by 10%. One of the hunters says that the dungeon is hotter than he expected, and the other tells him to think of it as a sauna. Dong-hoon looks around and sees the shaking porters, wondering if it's really that hard for everyone. The necromancer tilts his head to the side, thinking that this is more than bearable for him. The guy thinks it's child's play compared to the hellish massage he gets from the old man every day. Raising his staff up, Dong-hoon uses a skill that summons awakened D-rank skeletons. 5 Kostyanovs appear next to him in the desert in the blink of an eye. Kostyan 4 steps forward and places his shield on the sand with a loud bang. The rest of the squad members look in amazement at the Kostyanovs who appeared out of nowhere. One of the hunters who took part in the last expedition approaches Kostyan and tells Dong-hoon that this time they are stronger skeletons. Jae-ho claps his hands to get everyone's attention and tells everyone to focus, and states that the main type of monsters here are scorpions and snakes. Some of the hunters flinch at the mention of snakes, and Jae-ho quickly reassures them, reminding them that they are only C-rank monsters. The leader of the detachment approaches the porters and tells them to pick up what they are told, and to pass on what they are told. Some time passes and the squad continues to move deeper into the dungeon. The skeletons do not look tired, while the hunters complain that they are very hot and ask how much longer they have to go. Jae-ho, who was walking in front, suddenly raised his hand and ordered everyone to stop. However, in front of them all that is still visible is sand dunes and flying sand blown away by the wind. One of the hunters looks into the desert and says with a grin that there is nothing here. But the next moment he falls silent because he hears a strange hum that makes him shudder. Scorpions suddenly appear from the sand, jumping up and trying to attack the hunters from above. Jae-ho was ready, so he immediately drew his sword. He strikes confidently at the scorpions, killing them one after another. The hunter turns to the squad and tells them to gather and stand in battle formation. The rest of the squad is clearly frightened, but they still accept his order, taking their positions. Dong-hun stands at a distance and watches the battle, thinking that the C-rank desert scorpions are just as strong as the orc he fought. The necromancer turns towards the skeletons and calls Kostian 5. Dong-hun orders him to use an air shield on him, and Kostian immediately follows the order. The guy feels a slightly visible barrier appear around him. After this, he calls the rest of the Kostians, forcing them to turn to him. Dong-hun raises his staff up and with a smile on his face, orders the Kostians to destroy all the scorpions. The necromancer thinks that he was able to ensure his own safety, so he can now help others. Kostian 4 forcefully lowers the shield to the ground and begins to push it like a battering ram. The system notifies Dong-hun that Kostian is using a skill, a low-level aggro of the first level. The necromancer sends the rest of the Kostians after the 4th. The system reports that the desert scorpions have turned their attention to Kostian 4. At this moment, Kostian 1 raises his sword over the scorpions. The sword hits the scorpion's body, but does not penetrate its defense. However, Kostian does not stop and continues to strike one blow after another. Surprisingly, it works, and the desert scorpions fall to the ground. Dong-hun orders the Kostians to continue attacking, because if they continue to hit, the defense will collapse. A hail of arrows and sword and spear blows rain down on the monsters. Soon, the Kostians manage to break through the scorpion's defense, and Kostian 2 pierces one of them with a spear. The necromancer stands aside from everything that is happening and watches the battle in surprise. He thinks that everything is going more smoothly than he could have imagined. Jaeho comes up behind Dong-hun and says that the necromancer's skeletons are amazing and that they were very lucky to meet by chance. The necromancer waves it off and says that he was able to do something because Jaeho dealt with the largest group of monsters. With a laugh, the hunter tells Dong-hun not to be modest, and the necromancer thanks him for his favor. However, the guy thinks to himself that Jaeho talks about a chance meeting too often, which makes Dong-hun wary. Leaving the conversation, the necromancer turns his gaze to the other participants of the expedition. Dong-hun notices that all the members of the squad are very strong, so he doesn't understand why they had to bring an E-rank hunter with them. The hunters taking part in this expedition also took part in the previous dungeon and know that it was Dong-hun who received the reward. Due to a non-disclosure contract with the Parang, hunters cannot openly speak or ask the necromancer about the reward. So the hunters decided to see Dong-hun's abilities in person under the pretext of clearing the dungeon. Accidents often happen in the dungeons, but there are no cameras in them, so it is not possible to sort out the situation. After some time, Dong-hun begins to notice that some of the squad members are looking at him strangely. The necromancer thinks that he must act carefully, because now this is only his suspicion. One of the Kostians walking ahead of Dong-hun turns around and notices Jaeho, who is left behind. There is a smile frozen on his face that does not bode well. Sometime later, the squad approaches some ruins, in the center of which is a door with a scorpion painted on it. The system notifies that the time has come for the stage, the ancient king of the desert scorpions, and in order to remove the seal, a sacrifice must be made. On either side of the door, there are 2 altars on which 2 offerings must be placed. The system reports that the victims must be living hunters of F rank or higher. Dong-hun doesn't remember anyone telling him that a sacrifice was about to take place. The 2 girls who are the porters are frightened when they hear that the hunters seem surprised by the condition. The hunters pretend not to understand how this could happen and have no idea where they can find prey in the desert. However, from their look, everything can be understood. They had prepared for everything in advance and were now looking predatorily at the 2 porters. One of the girls looks at them with fear and asks the leader of the group what this all means. Jaeho asks what exactly she doesn't understand, since the system directly said that they need to sacrifice 2 F-rank hunters. The leader asks them why the girls are still standing in place and orders them to go upstairs. The girl yells at him, asking if they're all crazy, and the guy tells her to think so if it makes her feel better. The second girl asks them why they are doing this to them. The younger girl asks in horror if they had this plan from the beginning, and Jaeho laughs in response. The leader asks if they found it strange that they were offered higher pay than usual. Jaeho takes out his sword and says that if they want a large sum, they must pay a high price. Dong-hun watches all this from the side and understands why the leader acts like this in his presence. Jaeho has no doubt that he can easily defeat the necromancer. Dong-hun catches the leader's gaze and starts to get angry. Jaeho turns his gaze back to the bearers and orders them to stop resisting and go to the altar. However, the next moment, a man with a staff appears in front of the porters. This makes Jaeho surprised, and he asks what it means. Dong-hun blocks the porters and hears the leader say that he shouldn't interfere with this or they'll consider it a challenge. Jae-ho says that the necromancer is more naive than he thought, or maybe he's just playing the hero. Dong-hun orders him to shut up and asks what their goal is. Jae-ho pretends not to understand, and the necromancer asks why he came to his guild and brought him here. The leader avoids answering, and this starts to anger Dong-hun, so he starts yelling at Jae-ho. Jae-ho says that the necromancer didn't get through the dungeon just by luck, so they were curious to find out what was so special about him. The leader says he doesn't understand how Dong-hun defeated the rancor, but that's why they went so far and brought him to the dungeon. But despite their threats, Jae-ho says they have no intention of fighting him. Dong-hun asks what this means, and they tell him that they called him specifically so that he would find out what kind of people they are. Jae-ho wanted to know if the necromancer wanted to join them. The leader says that if Dong-hun wants to join them, he will need to give up half of everything he got from the successful meeting. The necromancer clearly doesn't want to join them, so he simply calls them crazy. Dong-hun realizes that they are almost literally saying that they are villains and are asking him to join them. If he agrees, they will demand that all the rewards be given to them. Dong-hun looks at them with hostility and decides that they will not get anything from him. Jae-ho grins maliciously and holds 2 blades at the ready to attack at any moment. The other hunters are also ready to fight and are confident that they can defeat Dong-hun with numbers. The mentor that the necromancer summoned recently says that he knew this would happen when Dong-hun said he would go into the dungeon. The boy turns to him and quietly asks the old man to give him advice. The mentor tells Dong-hun to accept his fate, because the necromancer is no match for these hunters. The old man says that he regrets that the guy who claims to be his student is not able to cope even with such weaklings. Dong-hun whispers to him to stop complaining and says that if he dies here, the teacher will not be able to achieve his goal. The mentor replies that he is not to blame for this, and despite the fact that he has mastered all the techniques, he is not able to do the impossible. One of the hunters says that this is his first time meeting Dong-hun, so he asks politely what the guy got in that dungeon. After his words, Dong-hun finally understands what they want from him. The hunters need the reward from him, which he received after the battle with the master of all techniques. Suddenly, an idea appears in the necromancer's head on how to resolve this situation. The hunters try to intimidate him and pretend to be in control of the situation, but if Dong-hun doesn't cooperate, they're in trouble. The mentor is able to read the thoughts in the necromancer's head, so he begins to stroke his beard in surprise. Dong-hun directly asks the hunters if they want to know about his ability. The hunter who asked the question earlier answers in the affirmative, explaining that even Gi Soil couldn't get through the dungeon. Dong-hun nods and says that he will tell everything since he is being asked by an A-rank hunter. The hunter puts the throwing daggers back into his cloak and says that the necromancer made the right choice. But Dong-hun cuts him off mid-sentence. The necromancer says he won't say anything until the hunter allows him to fight the traitors on their team. Dong-hun says that until he fights them, the disappointment and resentment in his heart will not allow him to speak. Standing behind Kostyanov and ready to attack, Dong-hun asks the hunter if he agrees with this deal. The man begins to get angry because of the conditions that the necromancer put forward to him. The porters hid behind Dong-hun, hoping that the situation would be resolved in their favor. The necromancer says that he has some kind of mental disorder due to which he cannot stand it when his pride is hurt. The hunter looks at Dong-hun doubtfully and asks what he is planning. The necromancer waves his hand and tells the man that he is well aware that he will not be able to escape from the hunter. Dong-hun says that even if he is planning something, he still won't be able to deceive the eyes of an A-rank hunter. The man agrees with him, and then Jae-ho asks the hunter if he really believes what the necromancer says. Dong-hun says that he will die soon because there is a killer from the hidden shadows standing right in front of him. The necromancer says that even if he is not destined to survive, he will not let them leave unharmed. So he asks them to accept the terms of the deal. Otherwise, Dong-hun threatens them to kill themselves right now and points Kostyan-one's sword at himself. The hunter asks him to wait a minute, and his words make Jae-ho worried. The man agrees to Dong-hun's terms and says that he gives him exactly 30 minutes to carry out his revenge. He warns the necromancer that if he does something stupid, he will make sure that he lives in torment forever, unable to die. The hunter looks at Dong-hun menacingly and asks if he understood his words. Still holding the sword at his throat, the necromancer nods his head and agrees to his condition. Seeing this, Jae-ho becomes furious and veins start to appear on his face. He grips the dagger in his hand so tightly that it starts to tremble and asks Dong-hun if he really thinks he can defeat them. The necromancer lines up his Kostyans and says that they won't know until they try. Meanwhile, the mentor says that it is his time to help, so they will replace today's training with practice. The old man asks Donghun what needs to be done to defeat the hunter with whom the deal was made. They decide to conserve the maximum amount of power in order to use the minimum amount of effort for the maximum effect. The elder promises to teach the necromancer a strategy for using the enemy's power against him, and for this, Donghun thanks him. The guy uses his abilities, ordering the Kostians to begin the attack. The skeletons rush into battle, striking at the hunters, but they successfully block them. Jaeho leaps and in the blink of an eye is next to Kostian 4, plunging 2 of his daggers into his shield. Arrows begin to rain down on the hunters from above. Several of them rush towards Jaeho, but he jumps aside and they sink into the sand where the hunter had just been standing. Jaeho is very angry about the situation they find themselves in and curses at Donghun without holding back. At this time, Kostian 5, who was standing to the side, raised his staff into the air, and the system announced that he had used the skill, Fireball. A huge fiery mass moves towards the hunters at his command. The hunters start to run away in panic, and some of them are surprised that the skeletons have the ability to throw fireballs. Taking advantage of the moment when the hunters were distracted by the fire, Kostian 1 decides to attack. Raising his sword, Kostian strikes at Jaeho, but he successfully blocks the blow with 2 daggers. However, his happiness did not last long, and one of the daggers could not withstand the blow and broke. Seeing this, Jaeho realizes that things are bad for him, so he starts to swear. Kostian 1 kicks him in the chest with his foot, and the hunter flies to the side. The A-rank hunter watching all this thinks that the skeleton's movements are flawless and pure. The man begins to think that at this rate the necromancer could actually win the battle. Suddenly, the hunter's expression changes and he begins to look around. He senses the presence of some guy at the entrance to the dungeon, despite the fact that he should be outside and on guard. The beaten Jaeho tries to get up from the ground, but his whole body is shaking from the strain. He stops trying to get up the moment a shadow looms over him. Looking up, he sees a disgruntled Donghun staring at him. Jaeho starts to crawl back, telling the necromancer not to come any closer to him and to leave him alone. The mentor standing next to Donghun says that it was a good start even though the opponents were too weak. The necromancer says that he will be able to gain real combat experience with the killer with whom he made a deal earlier. Donghun sees that the hunter he made a deal with has turned away from them, as if something has distracted him. The necromancer orders Kostian 1 to take up a position for an attack, but suddenly his gaze becomes surprised. In a remote part of the desert, Donghun sees a silhouette quickly approaching them. The mentor puts his hand to his forehead and says that another such killer has just entered the battlefield. The old man says that Donghun is good at everything else, but he never thinks ahead. The necromancer looks at his mentor desperately and doesn't know what to answer. The elder is right in his words, because the guy has no more tricks up his sleeve and he is still a weakling in the world of hunters. Donghun grits his teeth, not understanding why he was so confident. The staff in his hands begins to tremble with anger at himself. Noticing the man approaching, Jaeho starts laughing and asks if the necromancer really thought they would only take one man from the hidden shadows with them. Meanwhile, the man who had recently entered the dungeon was already next to him. Donghun can only think at this moment that he needs to run as fast as possible. However, the killer who arrived grabs his colleague by the shoulder and says that they urgently need to leave because Gi So-yul has arrived. Kostian 1 and Donghun's expressions became stupid because they didn't understand how So-yul felt about this. At this time, the girl was standing next to the entrance to the gate. The hunters from the hidden shadows decide to act immediately, because if they are caught, they will definitely be killed. Jaeho, who was bursting into laughter a second ago, now looks in shock at the retreating silhouettes of the hunters. Realizing that they are running away from the battlefield and have no intention of returning, Jaeho begins to shout after them. But despite his cries, the silhouettes had already become invisible to the eye, and in the direction where they had fled, sand rose into the air. Donghun looks at them in surprise and wonders if this is the power of a rancor. Meanwhile, on the street next to the entrance to the dungeon, Gi So-yul is standing as if waiting for something. The girl stands with her arms crossed and thinks that she may be overreacting to the situation. She begins to realize that her surveillance of Donghun is starting to feel like stalking. So-yul says she was able to track the necromancer to the dungeon with Parang's information. She starts to think that she is doing the wrong thing, so she turns around. So-yul convinces herself that the guy will tell her everything as soon as he sorts things out, if she gives him time. The girl decides to wait a little longer, so she goes in the other direction from the entrance to the dungeon. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, Jaeho rises from the ground, shaking with anger and pain. He sees how the hunters from his team are defeated and are unable to resist the Kostians. One after another, the skeletons strike with their weapons. Jaeho thinks that he can't just die like that, so he decides to survive at any cost. He draws attention to the porters who hid behind the columns to avoid being hit. The sounds of a battle that has not yet ended are heard across the desert. Jaeho has used up all his strength, but continues to think about how to win. Donghun looks at him from the side and understands that the hunter will not engage in open combat, so he plans to harm the porters. After waiting for the right moment, Jaeho rushes towards the porters, trying to avoid falling into the hands of the skeletons. However, his actions do not go unnoticed by the necromancer, and he sends Kostian one to attack. The skeleton jumps forward and raises his sword to strike. In the blink of an eye, Kostian appears in front of Jaeho, blocking his way. The skeleton strikes the hunter, and he instantly loses his arm. Donghun looks at Jaeho, who is screaming in pain, and wonders if he would have spared him if the necromancer himself was weaker. The guy doesn't doubt for a second that the hunter would show no mercy. Donghun looks at the suffering man and realizes that no one on his team would take pity on him. Jaeho presses his hand to the wound and screams that he won't just tolerate whatever the necromancer does to him. Gathering all his remaining strength, the hunter rushes towards Donghun. The necromancer looks at him, but does not move from his place, as if not afraid of him. Kostian 1, who had been standing next to the owner all this time, throws the ball up. With one blow, he cuts off Jaeho's leg, preventing him from getting close to Donghun. The hunter feels excruciating pain, causing him to clench his teeth with force, and the next moment he falls to the ground, no longer able to get up, and screams loudly. He curses at Donghun, but Donghun continues to look down at him with an impassive expression. With his only remaining hand, Jaeho slaps the ground, asking why Donghun had to appear before him. The necromancer comes closer to the hunter and asks what he is talking about. Crouching down in front of the hunter, Donghun corrects him, saying that it was Jaeho who appeared before him. The hunter bows his head to the necromancer and asks him not to waste time and kill him. Donghun asks him what it means to kill. The necromancer apologizes to Jaeho and says that he won't die so easily. The hunter clenches his teeth in anger and raises his head again. Jaeho grabs the necromancer's hand and shouts for him to kill him quickly. However, his hand is intercepted by Kostian 1. The skeleton twists his arms and lifts the boy's body up while he asks what they are doing to him. Kostian 1 cannot answer his question, so he drags the hunter along with him. The skeleton throws Jaeho's body onto one of the altars near the boss entrance. Donghun reminds the hunter that they need to sacrifice 2 living hunters to open the boss room. Jaeho screams angrily, but the Kostians already managed to place another hunter on the second altar, and the system notifies that all the sacrifices have been made. Donghun thinks that if all this hadn't happened, he would have simply left this dungeon without clearing it. However, this situation helped him to fulfill the conditions. The necromancer believes that what happened is no longer considered his fault and is a completely different story. Donghun is confident that he is only giving what he gets. The necromancer repays kindness with kindness, and at that moment looks at the frightened porters. Looking at Kostian 2's bloody spear, he thinks that he is taking revenge for the insults. Seeing Jaeho cursing, he says that if someone wants to take his life, then he will take it in return. After checking, the system notifies that all conditions are met, and the door begins to open in front of Donghun. The bodies of the hunters disappear from the altars, and the system says that the ancient seal has been removed. The necromancer silently says goodbye to the hunters and wishes that they live well in the next life. Before entering the door, Donghun looks around. He tries to understand why Gi So-yul hasn't arrived yet. The shadow ghosts scattered because they were afraid of his imminent appearance. Donghun sighs in relief, thinking that if it weren't for Soil, he would have had to fight 2 A-rank hunters. Looking towards the altars, the necromancer thought that otherwise he might have ended up on one of the altars. A huge stone wall begins to rise upward with a roar. Donghun gets scared and steps back for a second, afraid that something scary will appear. The system announces that the ancient Scorpion King has been released. A growl comes from the crypt, and the system says that the Scorpion's fury, suppressed for centuries, has burst into the heavens. The porters standing behind Donghun begin to shake with fear. The system also notifies that awakened D-rank skeletons are suppressed in the presence of a strong creature, and their stats are reduced by 20%. This information makes Donghun start to get nervous. One of the porters comes closer to the necromancer and asks him if everything will be okay. Donghun says he can't say for sure, but it's a lot better than fighting shadow ghosts. His words do not help the girl calm down, but she decides not to interfere with the necromancer anymore. Donghun thinks that he needs to calm down and do what he trained for. The mentor appears behind the necromancer and says that he can handle this and does not need such an insignificant creature as the old man. For Donghun, the old man says that it would be better for him to die if he fails to complete such a simple task. The necromancer asks the elder to stop joking, but he says that he is not joking and asks not to forget to call him every day. Donghun looks questioningly at the mentor, but he dissolves into thin air, and the system notifies about the end of the skill's duration. Training in all techniques. The necromancer only now understands why the old man said goodbye to him. Time was over, and they could no longer stay together. Donghun's attention is drawn to a sound coming from the entrance to the crypt. Turning around, he sees a giant scorpion crawling out of the crypt, making terrifying sounds. Donghun clutches the staff in his hand and realizes that he will have to face the monster alone. At first, the necromancer looked inspired, but after another growl from the scorpion, the guy became scared. Even though the skeleton's strength had been reduced by 20%, they had already taken up battle positions, ready to attack. However, after a few moments, the scorpion disappeared from Donghun's sight. This made the guy wonder if he should expect an attack from underground. Deciding not to take any risks, Donghun orders Kostian 5 to use the skill, Air Shield. The necromancer orders the remaining skeletons to disperse and form a line. Kostian 4 stands in front of Donghun, taking a defensive stance. Kostian 3 takes a stance and pulls the bowstring, but feels that his position is unstable. Looking down at the ground, he notices that the ground beneath his feet is starting to crack. A second later, a giant scorpion emerged from the ground, knocking Kostian off his feet. Donghun thinks that the scorpion most likely has intelligence, since it ignored the necromancer and attacked Kostian 3, who was standing behind him. The scorpion has come out completely and is now looking around, deciding who to attack first. After looking towards Donghun, the monster turned around and headed towards Kostian 1 and 2. Having chosen them as his victims, the scorpion let out another roar and rushed towards them. Donghun sees the scorpion attacking the other Kostiatnovs and orders Kostian 4 to go to them. The skeleton hits the ground with force and uses a skill, low-level aggro. His actions attract the attention of the scorpion, and it turns towards him. Donghun can see that the attention-getting method worked well because the monster rushes towards them. As the monster approached and dealt the first blow to Kostian 4's shield, the system notified that the skeleton had used a skill, a low-level block. Donghun thought happily that Kostian 4 had managed to block the scorpion's attack after all. The necromancer clutched the staff in his hand and thought that now he had a chance. Donghun turns to Kostian 5 and mentally gives him instructions. Kostian 3 also heard the order, so he stood up and took a fighting stance. Seeing that all the skeletons were prepared for battle, the necromancer gave the order to attack the target. Several arrows and fireballs instantly flew at the giant scorpion. Having closed the distance, Kostian 1 and 2 began to attack the monster with a sword and spear. Donghun sees the scorpion getting injured and thinks that no matter if the monster has a weakness, no one is strong against the group. The monster seemed to read his thoughts, and after that began to spin in a circle, knocking Kostianov off his feet. The melee skeletons were thrown back, but instantly rose to their feet and prepared to attack again. Donghun knows it's not as simple as it first seemed, but it was still effective. The necromancer sees green liquid flowing from the monster's wounds, indicating that they are causing damage to it. Donghun orders the skeletons not to be afraid to die and to continue attacking. The necromancer calls up the system table, in which he sees that he has 50 units of energy left. Donghun happily notes the fact that he still has the energy to summon the Kostians again. The necromancer believes that his skeletons are practically invincible and sees Kostian 1 raising his sword to strike the monster. However, the next moment, the scorpion's claw hits Kostian 1's head, causing him to disappear from the battlefield. But the next second, the necromancer makes a call, and the skeleton appears again in front of the scorpion. Scorpio makes a sound as if he doesn't understand what just happened. The Kostians rush back into battle, not worrying about disappearing. Confidently, Donghun sends Kostian 1 and 2 into battle. The skeletons approach the monster, and Kostian 1 raises his sword over it. The scorpion wants to attack the enemy with its tail with poisonous glands. However, his attempt fails because one of the skeletons cuts off his tail. The skeletons decide to attack from above, so they jump up. Kostian 2's spear plunges into the monster's body, piercing the skin. Donghun looks at what is happening in amazement and cannot believe what they have accomplished. The scorpion falls to the ground, and the system notifies that the necromancer has defeated the ancient king of the desert scorpions. The guy falls to his knees in relief because he realizes he only has 10 units of energy left. Donghun looks at the monster's corpse and thinks that if the scorpion had been a little stronger, they would have lost. The skeletons begin to burn with purple fire, and the system notifies that their stats and characteristics have increased. Donghun expected this from a C-rank boss, but suddenly he notices a message that he found the poison gland of an ancient C-rank desert scorpion king, and the system asks if he will take it. The necromancer realizes that this is most likely a valuable item and accepts the system's offer, taking the find. A round purple stone appears before Donghun's eyes, which is the same poisonous gland. The system says that iron contains about 20 types of toxic poisons that can be used to make weapons or as an ingredient for skills. Kostian 3 starts to behave strangely and moves towards Donghun. His actions attract the attention of the necromancer, and he looks questioningly at Kostian. The system notifies that Kostian 3 is reacting to the poison gland of the ancient king of desert scorpions. The system says that the necromancer has fulfilled a hidden condition, the creation of a poisonous arrow which requires a certain amount of luck. Donghun looks at the message in shock and is surprised that the skill can be unlocked like this. Finally, he understands why the Dark Lord kept talking about the benefits of the dungeons. The system asks if Donghun wants to learn the poison arrow skill, to which the necromancer agrees. The next moment, the system congratulates the necromancer on having passed the stage, the ancient king of the desert scorpions, and received a reward. The light begins to blind his eyes and Donghun can no longer see anything around him. A few moments later, he finds himself in the middle of the forest where he and his team had entered the dungeon not long ago. The porters were also transported back to the human world, and one of the girls breathed a sigh of relief. The girls began to jump joyfully from the fact that they managed to survive and began to thank the necromancer for saving them. The guy tries to calm them down and tells them to take this as a lesson and not go anywhere else just because they were offered more money. The girls say goodbye to the necromancer, thanking the guy once again, and leave, leaving the guy alone. Donghun waves at them and waits for the moment when the girls disappear from his sight. After that, the guy decides to check what reward he received, and it turns out to be an item, a trace of an ancient B-rank desert. A bright light appears on Donghun's palm. The necromancer cannot see what is in his palm, but soon the light fades. When the light finally disappears, a key appears in the necromancer's palm. The system tells that this is a key that unlocks the secrets of a hidden relic, and that it can open the ancient desert dungeon. Donghun guesses that it's some kind of linked dungeon or something. The necromancer is so engrossed in studying a new object that he doesn't notice a figure approaching him. Donghun wished that someone would tell him more about this subject. Finally, the necromancer notices out of the corner of his eye a figure standing behind him. He sees Soil, who looks calm and greets her. The girl reminds that the necromancer asked to give him time to collect his thoughts, and she thought that he was already ready, since he was walking through the dungeons. Soil also points out that if she hadn't come herself, the guy would never have gotten involved with her. Donghun stutters and answers that he understands everything, and one of his Kostianovs starts shaking his head. The necromancer begins to actively think about whether he should tell the truth or lie. Donghun looks at the dagger on the girl's belt and thinks about what might happen if she catches him in a lie. The necromancer remains silent for a long time, and this begins to anger Soil. Donghun thinks that it would be better for him to tell the truth, and then nervously swallows his saliva. The guy justifies himself by saying that he is a novice hunter who knows nothing about this world. The necromancer believes that this chance should be used to establish contact with the rancor. Gathering his courage, Donghun asks Soyul if she wants to know how he got through that dungeon and what reward he got from it. The guy confidently tells her that he will tell her everything. However, he tells Soyul that he has one condition. The girl looks at him in surprise and asks what this condition is. Donghun says that firstly, she has to protect him while he develops. Soil suggests that the guy owes someone something, but he says that hooligans are simply hunting him. The girl asks what else he wanted to ask her for in exchange for the information. Donghun says that he is a newbie and asks Soyul to teach him some things, like what the key he received is for. The girl looks at the key handed to her in surprise and asks if it is a medium. The guy sees from Soyul's reaction that the thing might be worth something, so he asks if she knows anything about him. The girl asks the necromancer if he got this key in today's dungeon. Donghun answers positively, and Soyul says that the guy is incredibly lucky. The girl says that less than 100 such keys are known in the world, and they are incredibly valuable, as they are tied to one owner. However, the girl's words do not help the necromancer understand what this key is for. Soil says that mediums are a lucky opportunity because when a person immerses himself in them, quests related to him appear. Associated quests increase in rank. Eventually, they all reach S rank and above. All known Soil mediums have reached the highest rank. Donghun looks at the girl in surprise and asks again about the ranks. Soil says that all the rankers, including her, are desperately searching for these items. The girl looks sadly at Donghun. upset that he was the one who received this valuable item and says that she agrees with his conditions. A beaming smile appears on the necromancer's face and he asks Soil if she is joking. However, the girl interrupts his joyful cries. She says that she also has one condition. After some time, Donghun and Soyul find themselves near the guy's apartment and he enters the password on the door. The door opens and a dark corridor appears before the girl with bags of garbage in the corner. Soyul's eyes widen in surprise, asking if the guy really lived in such a place. Donghun realizes that his apartment looks pretty shabby, so he asks the girl not to follow him. Soyul says that it had to be done because she made a promise, so the guy laughs nervously, cleaning up the scattered things. The girl looks around and says that there are no tracking devices in the apartment, and there are no hunters above D rank around the building, so the necromancer is safe. Soyul says that she has confirmed his place of residence, so she will stay on the roof for now. The guy looks at the girl leaving in surprise. Before closing the door behind her, Soyul tells Donghun to let her know when he's going to practice tomorrow. The necromancer agrees with her and then hears the door slam shut. Donghun recalls that the girl asked to let her watch his training. At that moment, he was very surprised by her request, so he asked why she needed it. Soyul said that she had been watching the guy lately and began to notice that he was becoming stronger exponentially. She became very curious about how he achieved such rapid growth. Donghun finishes putting things back in their places and closes the closet. He thinks that he has already explained everything about the happy opportunity. The guy told Soyul everything about the old man. He also told us what kind of training he undergoes with his mentor. Donghun stands in front of the closet and thinks that he has only one problem left. And it is that he has come into contact with shadow ghosts who could start threatening him at any moment. The necromancer thinks that he will return to them as much as he receives from them. The next day, it was time for training with a mentor and another massage. Donghun still can't get used to this kind of bullying. The mentor continues to strike and tells the boy not to react so sharply as the necromancer's body begins to take shape. With a sadistic smile on his face, the old man says that it's time for them to change up the massage a bit. He decided they needed to increase the intensity, so he started throwing harder punches. Donghun begs him to stop and says that it now feels more like violence. The mentor angrily asks what the boy's words mean. He asks what right Donghun has to call his technique, which he painstakingly developed for many years: violence. Having ordered him to be silent, the mentor began to massage with even greater zeal. The system notified that Donghun had developed the pain-resistant skill again, but he had no time for that. Soyul, who had been watching the training from the sidelines the entire time, came closer to the guy lying on the ground. Donghun asks what she's looking at, and Soyul replies that she still can't get used to the fact that a guy goes through this training every day. The necromancer told everything that was connected with the old man and his training. Even despite this, the girl still cannot see the mentor and repeat after him. Soyul doesn't even realize that there is an old man standing next to her, ordering Donghun to get up from the ground. The necromancer obeys him and rises to his feet, muttering under his breath, mimicking his mentor. Yesterday was Kostyan 2's training, so today it was Kostyan 3's turn. Donghun feels that the skeletons are getting stronger every day, but is frustrated that he has to chase after them himself. Opening his status card in the system, the guy sees that he has an impressive set of skills. Today he has been able to master Kostyan's one-break punch. From Kostyan 2, he borrowed the skill, piercing. Thanks to Kostyan 3, he was able to master shooting. From Kostyan 4, he learned the skill of defense. Thus, Donghun mastered all of his skeleton's skills except for Kostyan 5's skills because his abilities are related to magic. In order to use his skill, Donghun needs to learn how to use Kui. While the necromancer was looking through his ability table, the mentor drew a circle on the ground with a hieroglyph inside. Stepping aside, the old man ordered Donghun to sit in a circle and sit cross-legged. The boy sits down and asks what he should do next, and he is told to recite the formula for the Great Blue Heart technique that his mentor taught him earlier. The elder tells him to concentrate and not to speak words mindlessly, as the necromancer needs to feel the formless energy moving within him. Donghun closes his eyes and remains silent for a while, trying to concentrate. Soon he begins to read the formula without opening his eyes. The necromancer hears his mentor telling him to focus on his breathing because it is important, as Donghun needs to feel the qi. Otherwise, the old man threatens that the training will become more severe, so Donghun decides to immerse himself in meditation. He sets himself up for the fact that everything will work out for him, and soon, light begins to appear between his palms. When practice ends, Donghun goes home and Soyul accompanies him, staying on the rooftop afterwards. She looks at the city at night from the height of the roof of the house, Soil remembers the training and can't believe that the guy actually became that old man's student. The girl remembers how many times the old man threw her out the door. Remembering the elder's face, Soil starts shaking. She thought that all the changes in Dong-hun were due to good fortune, but she personally witnessed the harsh training. Now Soyul acknowledges the guy's persistence on the path of self-improvement. Soil believes that she has no other choice, so she will watch the necromancer for now. That old man she couldn't do anything about is now next to this guy. Watching Dong-hun grow, the girl feels like she too will be able to overcome her limits someday. Soil is very curious about how much the boy can grow. Meanwhile, Dong-hun is sleeping in his room, lost in a restless dream. We are transported to the building of the main office of the organization Hidden Shadows. A man pours red wine into a glass. The shadow hunter who was previously in the dungeon with Dong-hun stands in front of him. A man with scars all over his face asks the hunters if they need support because of Gi So-yul. The hunter answers in the affirmative and nods his head, looking very nervous. The man's name is Nick Jacquin, and he is the owner of the Hidden Shadows Guild, and now he says that he does not want to get involved with Parang. The hunter bows to the leader and says that he should have sorted things out before Soil interfered. Nick taps the table and asks if this is really the opportunity that will allow him to hold the rankers in his hand. The hunter is sure of this, because otherwise a person like Soil would not show interest. Swinging his glass of wine, Nick says that this is a very tempting offer. The guild leader snaps his fingers. At this moment, a girl appears in the office out of thin air and asks Nick why she was called. The head asks her about the work schedule of the Hidden Shadows, and the girl replies that they are fully booked for the next month. Nick thinks about what can be done and asks what rank Zhu Dong-hun has. The hunter replies that the guy is an E-rank necromancer. The chief leans back on a chair and says that the guy still has a long way to go. Nick asks to clarify his schedule in a month, as he himself wants to see the necromancer. The guild leader smiles and repeats Dong-hun's name as if tasting it. Sometime later, Dong-hun is already exercising outside and counting down. Soil watches him with curiosity. After completing 40 repetitions of the exercise, Dong-hun lets out a cry of relief. He falls to the ground as if he has been training without rest all day. The girl calls the guy by name, trying to attract his attention. Dong-hun lies face down on the ground and, without turning around, asks what she wants from him. Soil takes a few steps towards the necromancer. She says she needs to tell him something. Dong-hun gets up from the ground and asks what the girl wants to tell him. Soil asks if the guy remembers that she promised to protect him until he became stronger. The guy grins and says he remembers, but he didn't think she would be watching him 24 hours a day. Soil asks how she's supposed to keep him safe if she's not always by his side. Dong-hun reminds her that she is a ranker, so she must clear dungeons and do other guild business. Soil just wanted to talk about this. She had been following the necromancer for several weeks, and she had urgent matters to attend to. The girl offers Dong-hun 2 options to choose from. He offers the necromancer to either follow her for 6 hours or use the medium key he received in the dungeon. Dong-hun remembers about the key he received only after Soil's words. By opening the system, the necromancer summons a mysterious item. After a few seconds, the key materializes on the necromancer's hand. Soil says that the key is the safest option since no one from the outside can interfere or disturb Dong-hun. The guy realizes that he will end up in a B-rank dungeon, so he asks if it will be more dangerous there. Hearing this phrase from the necromancer, the girl cannot help but smile. Soil says that it's not quite like that. Dong-hun might not even notice how much he's grown. She says it's a good opportunity to test her strength. Judging from the training she witnessed, Dong-hun should be able to pass it. The necromancer looks at the girl with embarrassment, not believing that the ranker praised him. The guy has a curse that can make him an abnormal necromancer. Because of this, many people did not recognize him as an E-rank mercenary. Hearing the praise from the ranker, Dong-hun couldn't believe that he had received someone's recognition. The guy confidently clutches the key in his hand. He believes that the second option will be the best, so he chooses it. Soyul asks when he's going to go, and Dong-hun replies right now since he's already finished his morning practice. The girl tells him to pour his energy into the key to activate it, and then the dungeon will appear. Dong-hun looks at Soyul uncertainly, but decides to follow her recommendation. The guy starts pouring his energy into the key, and it starts glowing. Dong-hun sees it start working, and the system asks if the necromancer wants to enter the dungeon. The system also issues a warning that the dungeon is solitary. Dong-hun looks at Soil and says he'll be back soon. The girl nods back at him with a smile on her face. Dong-hun activates the key and enters the dungeon. Ancient desert. A few moments later, the boy's foot steps onto the sand. The necromancer begins to look around. The system notifies him that the guy has discovered a pyramid. Dong-hun immediately uses his D-rank awakened skeleton summoning skill. A moment later, the Kostyans appear in the desert next to the necromancer. The guy decides not to rush because if you think logically, the dungeon should be inside the pyramid. Turning to the Kostyans, Dong-hun tells them to follow him. The Kostyans begin to shake their skulls affirmatively. Dong-hun realizes that they are only D-rank while the dungeon is B-rank. Based on this, they are too weak for this dungeon. No matter what, Dong-hun believes that they must fight. When the necromancer places his hand on the door leading into the pyramid, it begins to open. A long, dark corridor appears in front of Dong-hun. Looking at this, the guy says that everything was too easy. However, as soon as Dong-hun took a step into the pyramid, the system sent out a notification. It says that a connection was discovered between the dungeon and the hunter's profession, Ju Dong-hun. The system notifies that the dungeon is being transformed, so the necromancer will not be able to exit the dungeon. Dong-hun looks at the door closing behind them in shock. The door slams shut, leaving the necromancer and the Kostyans trapped inside the pyramid. An unknown force begins to spread from the door, forcing Dong-hun to cover his face. The force throws the necromancer and Kostyan off into the depths of the cave. Sometime later, Dong-hun begins to come to his senses and realizes that he can now move. He picks himself up from the floor where he found himself due to the force that knocked them all off their feet. The guy complains that he came in so confidently not only to find himself in a similar situation now. The necromancer is in pitch darkness, so he calls Kostyan 3 to find his location. After hearing the answer, Dong-hun decides that they need to scout out the situation first. Kostyan 3 launches a glowing arrow in the opposite direction from them, and the system notifies that he used the safe vision skill. The arrow flies far ahead and allows them to examine the room they find themselves in. Dong-hun looks ahead and realizes that there is an open space beyond. The necromancer moves forward, wondering if he has chosen the right path, but the next moment he realizes that the guy has no other choice but to move forward. As he approaches the glowing arrow, Dong-hun is blinded by the light, making it impossible to see what is around him. The necromancer covers his eyes with his hand, trying to make out the place he found himself in. Finally, he manages to see a hall full of skeletons armed with spears, and the system says that he has found himself at the stage, the insult of the solar spear. The system tells that in the depths of the pyramid there is a warrior and absolute ruler of the ancient empire of the desert, the solar spear. To complete the mission, Dong-hun needs to break through the obstacles and reach the solar spear. The necromancer thought the dungeon would be quite difficult, but he didn't think it would be this difficult. We are transported to a deserted city in the desert. An unknown person, whose face is covered by a hood, makes a growling sound. The black wing behind his back spreads out, causing several small feathers to fly out to the sides. A man with a mustache screams, calling the unknown person a monster. Several men vied with each other to call the unknown man a half-breed and said that he could not be one of them. The guy in the cloak thinks about how some of them tried to cut off his arms as soon as he was born. Some of the residents wanted to cut off his ankles. Finally, someone dared to take his eyes. One of the townspeople rushes at the guy with a dagger, intending to kill him. Despite the fact that the guy is blind, he lunges and reaches his opponent faster, striking him. From this blow, the man is torn to pieces. Soon, several more bodies fall at the feet of the guy in the cloak. He killed everyone who dared to threaten him. The guy stands over their bodies like a raven over its prey. He believes that he is doing the right thing, because these people wanted to take what belongs to him. Therefore, the guy thinks it is right that he takes from them everything that belongs to them. We return to the action in the pyramid, where Dong-hun faces an army of spear-wielding skeletons. The guy curses when he hears that the system gives an unusual warning about an approaching danger. 100 D-rank ancient skeleton spearmen begin to approach him. Dong-hun orders Kostyan 4 to block their attacks from the front. The necromancer thinks that he needs to lure everyone into the corridor, where the skeletons won't be able to attack all at once and the guy will have a chance to fight back. He plans to build a corridor defense and destroy them several at a time. The skeletons continue to approach the necromancer's squad. Several spears hit Kostyan's shield at once, but it withstands the attack. To the side of Kostyan 4, Kostyan 2 begins to counterattack, striking at the hostile skeletons. In one blow, he manages to defeat one of the skeletons. Dong-hun keeps his staff at the ready to call his Kostyan's back at any moment. The spears continue to try to break through Kostyan 4's shield, but all their attempts end in defeat. Dong-hun understands that sooner or later Kostyan 4's stamina will run out, so he orders the Kostyans to retreat slowly. One of the hostile skeletons grabs Kostyan 2 by the leg, not allowing him to step back. But a second later, an arrow hits him. Dong-hun looks back and sees Kostyan 3, who is successfully covering their retreat. The necromancer is distracted and does not notice that he has become the skeleton's new target. Feeling the danger approaching, the guy turns around and sees a spear flying towards him. However, the guy is not afraid and immediately decides to counterattack. He grabs the spear and changes its trajectory. Meanwhile, Kostyan 1 successfully survives the attacks of hostile skeletons, for which he receives praise from his master. Kostyan 5 is a ranged skeleton, so together with Kostyan 3, he covers the backs of his allies. Kostyan's skills have increased due to intensive training, so he can summon a level 8 fireball. A huge column of fire rises to the ceiling of the room, then, having gone around the allies, hits the enemy side. Kostyan's attack 5 helps to destroy several skeletons at once. However, the rest remain fine and are not going to wait for anything. They trample their fallen allies with their feet. The skeletons continue to inevitably approach the necromancer and his team. Donghun realizes that this attack was not enough. But the necromancer does not give up and waits for the skeletons to come closer to them again. The skeletons, with renewed vigor, rush to attack Donghun and the Kostyans. The spears hit Kostyan 4's shield with greater force. This time, his shield fails, and it ends up broken in half, and the spears hit Kostyan himself. Donghun expected this, so he immediately raises his staff and makes another summoning of Kostyan 4. The system notifies that the necromancer has spent 10 units of energy, and Kostyan appears on the battlefield, full of strength again. The hostile bonemen look at the newcomer in shock, because they just defeated him, but he is unharmed again. Donghun thinks that even if his spear breaks, he will pick up another one and continue fighting. The necromancer decides to attack himself and strikes, destroying one of the hostile skeletons. He went beyond the defense of Kostyan 4, so now he became the enemy's main target. Donghun dodges the attacks, not allowing himself to be hurt. Seeing that the owner has entered the fight, the Kostyans, with renewed strength, also rush into battle. After a while, Donghun stands with his hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. The last skeleton remains alive, and the system reports that the solar spear sleeping in the pyramid has awakened and is now watching over them. The system says that the sun spear mocks the necromancer and asks if they really think they can defeat him with such skills. Donghun is starting to get angry at his words, and he still doesn't know who this solar spear is. But the necromancer is strengthened by the fact that he was able to clear the dungeon, which even Ranka could not pass through. Donghun tells Kostyan 4 that they should move on because that guy with the sun spear is making him angry. Kostyan 4 appears in front of the necromancer, and the guy thinks that they need to get to the boss no matter what. However, just as they are about to move forward, the system alerts them that another 100 skeletons are heading towards them. Donghun looks at this in surprise and begins to hope that they have entered the wrong dungeon, in which skeletons will appear endlessly until he reaches his goal. New armed skeletons are ready to attack. Donghun angrily starts killing one after another, thinking that at this rate there will be no end to it. Kostyan 4 holds the defense with the help of a shield. At this moment, Donghun comes up to him and asks him to give him the shield, saying that now he will tank. Taking the shield, the necromancer prepared to break through the crowd of skeletons. Before starting, Donghun ordered Kostyan 5 to cast an air shield on him and the others to cover him. The necromancer says that he will ignore enemies and run straight to the boss room. He will either reach his goal or fall before it. Gathering his courage, Donghun rushes into the crowd of skeletons. The enemies froze in surprise, not expecting such an attack. Donghun thinks that he should continue to fight them to push them back, and even if he breaks his left arm, he will use his right. Enemy spears hit the shield but do not penetrate it. Donghun feels the enormous power he is facing. However, the next moment he raises his shield up, throwing his opponents back. After this, he puts the shield back in its original position and rushes forward with a cry. The system tells Donghun that he needs to break through the obstacle and reach the solar spear. The necromancer understands this and continues to advance. His strength is already running out, but he is not going to give up, because all he needs is to get to the creature called the solar spear. The Kostyans cover his back. Having formed an armor-piercing squad, Donghun rushes into battle. The necromancer seemed to gain strength, and he enthusiastically approaches his goal. He rushes forward with force, supporting himself with the fact that he has very little time left. Ahead of him, a light actually begins to appear at the end of the tunnel where the boss room is located. When Donghun runs into the room, he falls to the floor, exhausted. Sunspear asks how they dare challenge him, since they are just worthless humans who are surprisingly weak. Donghun clenches his teeth in anger, thinking that this creature only knows about him that he is an E-rank hunter. At some point, the Kostyans step forward, blocking the owner's view. Donghun looks up and sees why they did it. Enemy skeletons appeared in front of them again. There were fewer of them now, but they still appeared. Dong-hun is angry that there is no end to them. Kostian-won, with a swing of his sword, cuts through several spears flying in their direction. However, one of them still reaches him, causing damage. Dong-hun at this time thinks that if he continues to fight, he will die, so he needs to break through no matter what. The guy angrily rushes forward, hoping that it will all end soon. Sometime later, Dong-hun tries to catch his breath. The guy turns his head to the side and sees a huge pile of bones. He looks at this pile for a long time. At some point, he realizes that these bones belong to the skeletons he just defeated. Suddenly, he realizes that he is simply running in circles from one room to another. So it doesn't matter whether he goes backwards or forwards, he will still end up at the same place where he started. The sound of bones clinking reaches his ears, so he turns towards the direction the sound is coming from. New skeletons continue to arrive, and the necromancer has no choice but to face them. Dong-hun tries to come up with a plan of action, and at this moment, Kostian-won protects him. The necromancer wonders if he should fight or if it's time to surrender. Checking his ability table, Dong-hun sees that he only has 20 energy left. Dong-hun looks towards the enemy and realizes that there are about 30 of them. He realizes that he has no choice but to start attacking. They must hold out as long as possible, so the necromancer orders the Kostians not to let the enemies get close to him. Kostian-won, having heard the order of the master, immediately jumps up and begins to attack the enemies. Meanwhile, Dong-hun looks around as if trying to find something. The necromancer begins to climb the mountain of bones, thinking that he must break through while his skeletons fight for him. Dong-hun tells himself that there must be a way out, because there are no dungeons that cannot be cleared. The guy manages to climb to the very top of the mountain of bones and says that it was tiring. The system again shows the task, which says that the necromancer needs to break through obstacles and get to the solar spear. Dong-hun tries to figure out where this solar spear could be, but suddenly something catches his eye. Above his head, on the ceiling, darkness thickened in the form of a black hole, and this made the necromancer assume that this was exactly what he was looking for. Dong-hun calls out to Kostian-4, who at this moment continues to fight the enemies. When Kostian turns to him, Dong-hun orders him to throw him up as hard as he can. Sunspear says that the guy was finally able to notice something, and the system reports that the necromancer is being teased. A voice comes from the black hole, telling the boy to come to him if he dares and threatening to turn Dong-hun into ashes. The necromancer stands on his shield and says that they will still see who will defeat whom. Kostian-4 throws Dong-hun up and he flies into a black hole. The necromancer sees that he is beginning to approach the unknown. At that moment, two red eyes begin to look at him from the darkness. Dong-hun stretches out his hand, trying to grab onto something that flashed in the darkness. At some point, the system notifies that Dong-hun has reached the solar spear. At that very moment, the ancient D-rank skeleton spearman disappeared. Dong-hun sees this and smirks, thinking that he has finally achieved his goal. The necromancer continues to hold the solar spear and says that it is time for it to come into the light. The system warns that the solar spear has been summoned. The darkness begins to thicken around Dong-hun, and the system suggests using the memory recovery skill. The necromancer agrees and begins to be transported into memories. Clouds are gathering over the sea, and a storm is beginning. The guy with wings raises his spear, which has the shape of the sun at the base of the blade. A spear adorned with a blue crystal is aimed towards the target. The man who became his target tries to dodge the blow. However, he fails and the spear catches up with him. The guy with wings says that it was they who started to bully him. It was they who isolated him. He believes that they have no right to reproach him for cruelty. When the boy gained his power, the townspeople bowed before him, calling him a great hero and warrior, and asked him to save their souls. The people who had previously mocked him now begged for his mercy. The guy chuckled, asking why he should do that. He thinks that he will never help them after everything they did to him. The guy is sure that all that is needed for the survival of this desert is death. The young man raises his hand up, ordering the townspeople to raise their spears. They obey his order and grab their weapons. Behind the backs of ordinary people stand warriors with spears in their hands. The guy with wings orders them to kill each other and burn everything to ashes like a dried-up sun. His crazy laughter cuts through the air. Dong-hun watches as if from the outside as the guy takes over the city and orders the inhabitants to kill each other. The system notifies that the memory restoration skill has ended. Dong-hun is blinded by the bright light, so he frowns to see something. The first thing he sees is large wings that hide the appearance of a young guy from him. The next moment, the wings stop blocking the view, and the necromancer sees a guy with a sun-shaped spear in his hand. Dong-hun guesses that this man is the Sun Spear. The necromancer looks at it and wonders if this is really a B-rank dungeon. A similar situation happened with the dungeon, in which the guy encountered the master of all techniques. The winged guy tells Dong-hun that he is a vile and evil person. Sunspear rushes towards the necromancer with screams, preparing to attack. Dong-hun understands that he won't have time to dodge this lightning strike. He closes his eyes, thinking that he is about to be stabbed. However, he feels someone take his hand and pull him to the side. Opening his eyes, Dong-hun sees a spear flying right in front of his eyes. The guy with wings looks at him in surprise, not believing that he missed. The elder who pulled Dong-hun away from the attack orders the necromancer to pull himself together. The boy looks at the old man in surprise because he didn't have the strength to summon him. Dong-hun hears the sun spear behind him, telling him that the boy was able to dodge his attack. The winged guy is angry that a mere human was able to resist his technique. He rushes into the attack again, wanting to kill the necromancer. However, his spear collides with an impenetrable barrier erected by the elder himself. The system notifies Dong-hun that the master of all techniques is using the skill. Absolute shield at the maximum level. The elder looks at the fallen disciple and says that he is too stupid to distinguish between illusion and reality. Dong-hun can't understand what his mentor is talking about. But soon, the necromancer begins to notice some strange things happening in this space. Rising to his feet, he assumes that this is all not real, and the master says that they are in his mind. The mentor explains that while Dong-hun was unconscious, the solar spear invaded his mind. The elder says that Dong-hun is not yet capable of defeating this opponent, so he orders him to step aside. The mentor says it's quite exciting to meet the monster that ruled the world. The old man says that this guy's spear skills are several times stronger than his own. Dong-hun asks if it's that bad, and the elder says that the guy is only stronger with the spear, but is much weaker than him in other ways. The mentor says that it was not in vain that he chose Dong-hun as his student, because now he has found entertainment to his liking. Taking out his sword, the old man looked menacingly toward the Sunspear and ordered it to attack. The winged guy immediately rushed towards him. Sunspear asked how the common people dared to block his way. They gouged out his eyes for no reason and mercilessly took away his freedom. The guy stabs them with a spear, saying that he will make them experience the same pain that he experienced. At the moment of impact, Dong-hun sees something familiar. He begins to analyze all the attacks of the solar spear in his head. The necromancer recalls that when he entered the pyramid, the system reported that it had found a connection between the dungeon and Dong-hun's profession. He begins to list what they might have in common and comes to the conclusion that they are the dead, the spear, and the skeletons. Finally, his gaze catches the trajectory of the winged guy's spear movements. He remembers seeing them during training. Kostian too honed the same movements. The thought comes to Dong-hun's mind that Kostian too might be the solar spear. The system notifies that the level of the sun spear's resentment is immeasurable, so Dong-hun needs to subdue it in order to achieve the true awakening of Kostian too. The necromancer shouts to the elder, drawing attention to himself. The mentor asks what the boy is doing, since he has already been told that the solar spear is beyond his strength. Dong-hun interrupts him and says that he has to deal with him himself. Sunspear turns his gaze to Dong-hun. The system notifies that the boss has chosen his main target. The necromancer looks back at him with fear, because he doesn't know how exactly he can defeat him. The elder asks the boy if he has a plan of action, and he replies that the creature in front of them is his summoned skeleton. The Sunspear is his creation, so the necromancer must defeat it on his own. The mentor looks at Dong-hun in surprise. The necromancer straightens up and thinks that this was not originally the master's scene, but his own. Dong-hun says that it's his mind, so he'll figure it out on his own. He will fight until all his hatred is exhausted. Until he is exhausted and gives up. Dong-hun confidently walks towards the Sunspear. He begins to get angry and scold the necromancer. By striking the ground with its spear, the creature says that Dong-hun is a deceitful and vile person. He calls the necromancer the most insignificant of all people. Sunspear believes that Dong-hun will never be able to understand him. He can never even imagine the pain and suffering he has endured throughout his life. Sunspear hates people and curses them. The creature raises the spear upward, as if raising the sun to the sky, after which he rushes at Dong-hun, ordering him to die. The necromancer, who had previously been convinced that he had to cope with his fear, now looks at the solar spear. He doesn't have time to dodge the blow, and the spear pierces his chest. The creature pulls the spear out of his chest, and Dong-hun falls to his knees. However, the solar spear does not calm down and raises its hand for another blow. The elder watches in amazement as Dong-hun takes every blow that is thrown at him. The hands of the sun spear are completely covered in the blood of the necromancer, but he does not calm down. Dong-hun is lying on the ground, and the system is notifying him that he is using the pain resistance skill. Despite this, the necromancer still experiences excruciating pain. However, he is still fine. The guy gets up from the ground and looks at the solar spear, thinking that the creature needs to throw out all its grievances. Dong-hun is still in his mind, so he transforms the staff in his hand. Now he holds a spear in his hand. The wounds on his body begin to heal at an incredible speed. The very next moment, he stands there safe and sound. Sunspear looks at the necromancer with anger. He asks if he really thinks he can bear his insult. The creature believes that this is impossible, even if Dong-hun understands it completely. He lunges at the necromancer, saying that he speaks too arrogant words. Dong-hun wastes no time and points his spear towards the creature, taking a defensive stance. The necromancer reflects all his blows one after another. Their spears cross during the fight. Sunspear says that in this world, no one has ever been on his side, because he is a hybrid of a human and an eagle monster. He angrily clutches his spear and asks if there is a person in the world who would like someone like him. Sunspear makes several movements, knocking the spear out of Dong-hun's hands. While striking at the necromancer, the creature said that since his birth, he had been stabbed by people's knives. He says that people took his eyes and wanted to take his arms and legs. He asks if Dong-hun knows this terrible pain. The necromancer falls to his knees after a series of spear strikes. He tries to say something, but the words come out of his mouth with difficulty. Dong-hun says that Sunspear had a really hard life. The creature says that there were people who pitied him, but then still turned against him. He remembers how the woman fed him for a while and then handed him over to the wars to be torn apart. Until the Sunspear's emotions died, people were a lie and a betrayal to him. People treated him like a monster, so he doesn't see anything wrong with becoming one. Dong-hun heroically endures all the blows from the creature, thinking that this is how resentment is let go. The necromancer begins to notice that the blows are becoming weaker each time. His thoughts are interrupted by a strong attack on the neck. Dong-hun falls back and sits up, asking how long he will continue to be sad. He mates who he thinks will suffer if he continues to endure pain. Taking the spear in his hands, Dong-hun tells the Sunspear to think about his words. The necromancer says that in reality, the creature knows the reason for its pain. With one blow, the solar spear knocks the weapon out of Dong-hun's hands, saying that he does not dare judge him as he pleases. The winged guy is shaking and says that it is good that the necromancer knows the reason for his pain. He was abandoned and his emotions were gone. They festered for hundreds of years, leaving scars that will never heal, so he doesn't understand what Dong-hun wants to change now. The necromancer agrees with him, saying that the past cannot be changed. Dong-hun extends his hand to him, offering him a chance to be reborn. Sunspear looks at the necromancer in surprise. He can't believe what they're offering him. Dong-hun says that the boy died and became a restless spirit who has already killed everyone who tormented him and is now suffering himself. Sunspear begins to remember everything that happened to him. He remembers that he buried himself in this pyramid after he killed all his offenders. Sunspear looks at his bloody hand. He asks if he can really live a new life.